I'm Andrew Price. Welcome to Deep Cuts, the podcast where we pick a topic and walk you through the ins, the outs, and the nitty-gritty so you can appear like an interesting and idiosyncratic person at your next forced social function. Today's topic is, what is QAnon? So before we get into the final stretch of the saga of QAnon, the final quarter of the story, I wanted to stop and take one last little breath before we get to that and explore a topic that is kind of the most important part of it to me, which is the idea of what is QAnon? What is its role in society? How should we interact with it? How should we react to it? And what should we do about the movement and the people that are involved with it? And are we behaving correctly and responding to this unprecedented event in the right way? And everybody wants to hear, the last part of the story, getting into 2020, into the pandemic, and all the stuff that led up to January 6th. That's the stuff that people want to hear. But to me, this is really the whole reason why I wanted to do this. And so I thought it was important to kind of take a pause from the story and explore this idea of what is QAnon? All of these questions and these labels that get thrown around and the way that people have dealt with and interacted with it in the media and on social media. And yeah, so we're gonna explore that. All of these questions like, is QAnon a cult? Are the people involved with it mentally ill? Are they stupid? Should we tell them that they're in a cult? What's the right way to talk with these people online? Should we talk to them online? Should we try to argue with them? Should we try to explain things to them? These are all things that I feel like nobody has really gotten a good handle on the right way to do it or how it should be done. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that people do on a daily basis to interact with QAnon and conspiracy thought can tend to be possibly destructive, counterintuitive, or just plainly toxic. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of these questions, but instead of just, speaking from my own perspective and my own opinion on things, which I definitely have, I wanted to try to get a little bit more of an objective viewpoint of things and talk to people who, not only have a lot of experience dealing with these things directly, but also are experts and authority figures in a variety of different aspects of what QAnon is. So today we are going to talk with 6 different people who have, varying degrees of expertise in QAnon and conspiracy theory movements and destructive conspiratorial thought, and really try to get to the bottom of these questions. And hopefully by the end of it, we kind of come away with a little bit better of an understanding of what QAnon is, why it affects people the way it does, what these people that are being affected by it and, indoctrinated into it are going through, how we should interact with the movement and these people, what we could potentially do to make things better, or at the very least, how we should conduct ourselves to not make them worse. So we have Rachel Bernstein, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist. In the last few years, she's been working with families to cope with losing a member to QAnon and other destructive conspiracy movements and cults, as well as helping former members of these movements to break out of their conspiratorial mindset. She is on the advisory board for the International Cultic Studies Association and hosts the Indoctrination podcast, which we'll link in the show notes.
I have been doing counseling for 30 years as of this year. My background is in education, and I still use it today for doing talks about a whole variety of issues that are connected to people maintaining their freedom, people not being manipulated, not taken advantage of, not being controlled without their consent.
We're also speaking with Joseph Kelly, a cult intervention specialist and thought reform consultant working in the industry for 30 years after himself experiencing being indoctrinated into a cult and escaping. He is a member of the Cult Mediation Group and helps families dealing with losing members to cults or trying to get themselves out of them.
And it was at that point that I was introduced to a group called Transcendental Meditation. For many people, it wouldn't have been considered a cultic relationship or group, but for me, it very much was. So that was the beginnings. And it was at that time that I decided to litigate and sue the Transcendental Meditative Movement for fraud and negligence. And it was then that I began to hear this body of information about the nature of influence techniques.
There's also James A. Beverley, Associate Director of the Institute for the Study of American Religion in Woodway, Texas, and Research Professor at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. He has specialized for over 40 years in the study of world and new religions, philosophy and religion, Christian theology and philosophy, and is the author and editor of 16 books, including The QAnon Deception and The QAnon Resource Guide, both of which have been immeasurably helpful and useful in the research for this series.
Well, I'm a Canadian scholar. I've studied religion topics mainly for over 40 years. And then about 5 years ago, I got interested in Donald Trump. And then that led into studying QAnon. And then writing one of the first books on it. One of the first books in terms of an outside analysis.
We're also talking to Mike Rothschild, a journalist, researcher, and debunker of conspiracy theories and fringe beliefs. He's a contributing writer to The Daily Dot and many other sites, including his own blog. His work in debunking conspiracies has been cited in articles or interviews by The New York Times, Snopes, NBC News, Vice, Right Wing Watch, Christian Science Monitor, PolitiFact, Huffington Post, The Week, CNN, and many others.
I've always been interested in conspiracy theories, and I was like, oh, people are looking for stuff about this. People are looking for answers. People need to know the truth about these things. And I started really looking into QAnon in probably about January 2018. And I started to get really concerned about the potential for violence in that movement. And as it turns out, I was right to be concerned because it's an extremely violent movement.
We're talking to Will Sommer, a previous guest of this QAnon series, a politics reporter for the Daily Beast and co-host of the podcast Fever Dreams.
I first noticed QAnon happening in maybe the winter of 2017, so a couple months after it began, and I was just like, this is crazy, but surely it will never get crazier than this. And obviously that was not the case.
And finally, Travis View, another previous guest on the QAnon series, who is a QAnon critic, a Twitter commentator, host of the QAnon Anonymous podcast, which we'll link in the show notes, and contributing writer to the Washington Post and other sites. He is also one of the people who's been covering the QAnon movement from a critical standpoint since basically the beginning.
If back in 2018, if I were to say, oh, there's going to be QAnon promoters, people who sincerely, at least at one point, believed in QAnon being elected to Congress, I would have been called hysterical. If someone said that to me, I thought it was like, okay, that's ludicrous. It's not going to get that bad that quickly.
So the first thing I want to talk about with the guests is QAnon a grift? There's a lot of debate about this in terms of, as we've kind of mentioned on a previous episode, that there's ostensibly not any direct money or kind of monetary gain being had by the people who are behind QAnon. There are definitely these influencers that are making a lot of money off of QAnon or have in the past, selling merchandise and books and classes and things like that. But the specific people themselves that run Q, at least on the surface, don't seem to actually want anything out of it in terms of money or any kind of material gain. Obviously with a lot of the stuff we've talked about on previous episodes of like who Q could potentially be, there could be some indirect grift going on in terms of money making if one of these influencers is potentially behind Q. But, to take it at face value and say that Q is a group of people and then all of these influencers are separate people, there's no direct monetary gain going on by Q. So, is Q a grift? And why do people buy into this? Why do people believe the lies? Why do they let themselves be scammed by this misinformation campaign? And sort of what is the relationship between Q in terms of what they want out of their audience, and why does their audience resonate so majorly with this thing?
It reminds me of this study that was done humorously that says tomatoes kill people. And it's because most people in their lives have had a tomato in one form or another, ketchup or tomato sauce or a tomato, and people die, but eventually. So I think that there is this sense that first people get caught up. They can do exactly as you said, that they will go to the opposite source of the one that they have decided not to trust, and they will they will go to the person who they think, or the news source they think is now the truth, because it's the opposite, not necessarily because it's the truth. And so, or because it's against the kind of truth tellers. And so that's when you have this Orwellian kind of world that we're living in now, I believe, where the fact checkers and the truth tellers are the evil ones, the ones who are part of the system are the ones who can't be trusted, but right, turn that off. The ones who are then part of something that you feel like you found on your own in this kind of renegade way are the ones that you can trust. They're the ones who really care. I think it also gives people this sense of power because there's so much about what's happening in the world, and that has been happening over the last number of years, that's made people feel powerless, that's made people feel deceived. So they will go to whomever they think are trusted sources. And usually it's the people who are equally distrustful that are the trustful sources. So, right, there isn't a lot of good analysis of the sources of information because there is kind of addictive quality to all of this. People get caught up. It's like they need their next fix, similar to a drug where you don't think, how is this going to play out in my life? And is this going to help my work and my relationships? Or is it just going to feel really good and really exciting right now to get the answer right now? And that's so much of what people are going for, to get their fix, I think, because I think it's a very energized world that we're living in terms of reactivity. And so whatever helps you maintain that level of reactivity, you think is somehow the truth and is right. But it is this informational echo chamber. And then people don't do comparative analysis because really it's not fun. I mean, the QAnon theories and other conspiratorial theories are like modern mythology. I mean, would you rather read the New York Times or something about Zeus? I mean, it's much more exciting, But yeah, well, I was curious the significance of focusing on comparing QAnon to previous financial scams and mini cults. What do you think the significance is of looking at QAnon and then kind of cross-referencing it and comparing it to some of these older things that you cover in your book, like the dinars and Nasara?
Yeah, and I really wanted to focus on those because they're not quite as well known as some of the other component parts of QAnon, things like the Satanic Panic or Pizzagate, the blood libel, things like that. Those are things that a lot of people in this world really know about. But I've had a lot of people, even who work in journalism, cover these things, say that they really didn't know anything about Nasara or they didn't know anything about the dinar. So I wanted to highlight these more obscure scams that don't, they're not mentioned in QAnon, like they're not part of that whole universe, but they work the same way. They work with a guru who has, special access to secret knowledge, and they're doling it out because they want people to wake up to this thing that's about to happen. And of course you can send them money to keep their information flowing, or you can get in on whatever investment they're selling. And with QAnon, whoever was doing this really learned from this. And I don't know if they knew what these things were, but I would be shocked if they didn't. They learned that if you are promising a return on an investment and you have links to selling that investment, you're committing fraud. You are breaking the law, and the FBI or whoever is going to get you. That's how these other things fell apart. The Omega scam fell apart when 18 people got indicted. The dinar scam has seen a dozen indictments, massive busts, hundreds of millions of dollars. QAnon is different in that there's nothing inherently illegal about posting crap on a message board. And there shouldn't be. There's no law that you're breaking with that. Q doesn't really incite people directly to violence. Q never says, "Hey, this guy, go out and kill this guy." There's a lot of kind of mob speak in it, but that's not necessarily illegal. It's unethical, it's immoral, but you're not going to get the FBI knocking on your door because you're posting, cryptic riddles that don't involve anything actually happening.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that reading, the reason why I think that element of it is like really important to be a companion piece in the book, before you get into talking about QAnon full on, is I think it's really fascinating and interesting to show people Because you look back at these old schemes that are like, these are things from the 90s and the 80s and things like that. And I think a lot of people think of, because people are being introduced to the idea of these like conspiracy theories and these like these sort of grifter empires where people sell influence and ideas to people through these like weird pyramid schemes. I feel like a lot of people think of them as like new things because they're just now hearing about them. Like most people, QAnon is like the first real like conspiracy theory movement that they've heard of. And I think some people kind of maybe think about them as like this new thing that's just come up out of nowhere. Like our world is going to hell. Everything's getting worse. And maybe that's true to a certain degree, but it's really interesting to read those things as a primer and be like, oh, like these things are very similar to QAnon and they've been happening for decades. So this is not a new thing. This is like an optimization of something that's been happening for a long lineage.
Yeah, it demystifies QAnon. It takes the kind of the sheen off it. It makes you feel less like, oh my God, what is going on now? Social media is ruining everything. These things existed before social media ever existed. You know, they operated with faxes. They operated on, you know, Usenet groups and bulletin board systems. You know, technology makes these things more accessible, easier to find, easier to participate in, you know, less work to be involved in them, but they're not new. And I think that's really what was important to me, was like just stripping back the new skin on Q and showing the engine. And the engine is very old and quite rickety sometimes.
There's sort of like there's a few different levels of it where you have the true believers, the sort of bottom of the pyramid, who are the people who have genuinely bought into it because of some of the things that you were just describing. There was one aspect of it that they really centered in on, is like, this really resonates with me. But then there's almost like, there's the layer above them, which is these people who are almost engaging in it very disingenuously, where they may believe it to some extent. They may believe the emotional aspects of it, but they ultimately know that these things aren't literally true, but that they are building these sort of grifts or these empires of merchandising and selling merch and selling
ready to eat meals. For the end times. There is that piece of it that they share with the cult, and that is the idea that there is an end time coming for many of the members, unless Donald Trump is put back in the White House. That the connection between him using this to his advantage, for I think many of the people who are on the right, who see the political gulf as being essential to their establishment and growth in the political sphere. While they cynically do not believe in the assertions of Q, they do see that this is effective at gelling a group together and maintaining a connection where they otherwise wouldn't have the ideology or the charisma themselves to keep those people connected into a force. So they can use Q, and yet they may not themselves be true believers. But their followers, the members who are voting for them, are true believers in Q. So you have both things going on. You have, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then you have, just somebody who's not willing to say, well, some of, like Trump, well, they're against pedophiles. It's like he throws that out. Well, who isn't? It's like everyone's against child being abused. At least everyone that I know who's a decent human being. So Q came up with nothing unique there. It's who's the perpetrator of this organized crime, and being a part of the in-group. During pandemic, you were, you were staying in, you were focused on yourself and what was going on behind the screen. You didn't need to know who they were personally and shake their hand in order to trust them. You began to trust those people who were giving you comfort in a time of discomfort in our nation. So there's a lot that was going on there, and it allowed people to pick up a lot of these ideas, I think, and hold on to them. So fragments, some people, were able to shake it off and walk away when Trump was not elected. There's those groups that are part of the big steel community, the big lie community, and that whole issue. They have strands of the belief There's those who see themselves as true patriots, rising up against fake news and the mainstream media. And so there's so many different contingents within the Q umbrella, and it's fascinating to see how it's taken so many individuals by storm. But to borrow the phrase, the storm is coming, I believe, is what they say, or it's here.
You've talked in the past about how the reason why you started sort of following this whole thing and why you sort of started engaging with the QAnon people is because you just became you just got mad that these people were just spreading these blatant lies, and that there was like nobody sort of like paying attention or caring about it, and you felt like it was kind of just like festering underneath a rock somewhere. So that all being said, this thing has been going on for like 3 or 4 years now, since 2017, and you've been following it for a long time. How in that time from then till now, how has your thinking and approach towards QAnon and the followers, changed and shifted over the years?
What I think I suppose the big change was that I lost a lot of hope that this kind of phenomenon would be sort of stymied by the powers that be. Because my fantasy when I was first sort of researching it in 2018 was that people with a great deal of influence, like politicians, like people who own social media companies, like psychologists, like academics, people who could actually perhaps have an influence over the bizarre beliefs that were festering online, would take action. This might involve, I don't know, perhaps Republican Party leadership making it clear that they didn't want any part of QAnon in their caucus, or that might involve tech companies early on realizing that QAnon was more than just one of the many conspiracy theories that people spread. It was a extremist movement that was radicalizing people, was hurting people. One of the sort of the first glimmers of hope I got was when Reddit, they banned the Great Awakening subreddit and also all other QAnon subreddits all the way back in September of 2018. I thought, okay, now finally, like the powers that be, the people who can influence this thing are taking action. What I kind of realized is that actually the people who had that kind of influence weren't really that interested. And like Twitter, for example, and Facebook, they didn't really take serious action about QAnon growing on their platforms until after January 6th. And, the Republican Party, they pushed back a little bit on QAnon. For example, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, he said once, like, there's no room for QAnon in the GOP. He later, however, claimed that he had no idea what QAnon is. And of course, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, a QAnon promoting member of Congress. At least at one point, she was promoting QAnon, which was absolutely unthinkable in 2018.
Each individual who's coming in connection with the ideas of Q and QAnon comes at it from a little bit of a different point of view, in that if there are 1 million followers of the Q philosophy, there are a million different QAnons. So you're experiencing, what is it that impacts you? The idea of the pedophiles, the Democrats being, secret members of a pedophile ring that grabs children and even, eats them, drinks their blood, which harkens back to a trope that goes back to the late 1700s, having to do with the Jews and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which the blood libel and dipping the matzah into the blood of Christian children. Well, they haven't gone there because we have mixed cultures that are approaching Q, yet the template is pretty much the same, and we see these templates repeating themselves over and over again. Weekly or monthly in the QAnon world. The latest baker, they call them bakers, the folks who are taking the crumbs of Q and forming them into digestible bread for the masses. So this is like the middle management, who some of them are making great money because they've drawn so many followers to their YouTube and various websites, and they're selling product. They're selling merch. They're selling supplements. So it's become a business for many of them. And I think even if they did want to back out because they know what they're spouting is not true, this is their means of income now. they're dependent upon it. So for certain individuals, I think it's a financial situation that they stay with the ideas of Q.
One thing I tell people is that most of us have to depend on authorities for what we believe, and we don't really absolutely know item X, Y, or Z. For example, I've read more than most people alive about the November 3rd election, but I wouldn't go in print to say what I absolutely know to be true. I mean, when somebody tells me that the images from the computer will show election fraud, I hardly know what that means. What do I know about pocket captures? I've got pockets in my pants, but I didn't know my computer had them.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really kind of the crux of it, or the heart of it, is like, it's, any human being, especially in our modern age, where with the abundance of information that we're exposed to in these just, fast drips all around us at all times, it would be physically impossible for you to become an expert on every single thing that you kind of need to believe or trust. It'd be physically impossible. So, by the very nature of society, especially now, we kind of have to trust in authority figures and kind of take their word for it that certain things are real or true or not. There are certain things that we will, by the very nature of our own particular interests and areas of focus, we will have more expertise at and do more digging, and not the like fake do your research digging, but like real research and real, investigative discovery. But for a lot of things, like why the sky is blue, like I'm not going to become an expert on light refraction just to believe that the sky is blue because of the reasons that they say. I'm just going to kind of believe the people that are experts. And the real sort of problem here, I think, is the way that people have eroded the concept of trust in authority figures, where it's not about whether or not things are true or not. It's about attacking the concept of trusting experts on things and undermining the entire concept of believing somebody at face value because of the training that they've gone through and the experience that they've had.
Well, anytime something becomes controversial, things then can't get decided by appealing to authority because the other side don't believe it. The great example of that is the debate now about whether you should get vaccinated. So it's divided into two camps, and people go with their different authorities. And the same in QAnon. The Q teachers would lead anybody to suspect mainstream government, mainstream science. So that's what makes American society right now so tense and so divided. You got competing worlds about absolutely huge realities, like who is the president of the United States, or should you get the vaccine? So things are a mess, and I don't think there's an easy way out. I think part of the problem is both camps on any issue. If there's two camps, they dig in and they don't want to admit anything that gives the other side credence. So, Biden is pictured in such a nasty way in the QAnon world or in the Republican world. And we all know how Donald Trump was pictured by big tech, the mainstream media, not to mention the Democrats.
The next thing I want to talk about with the guest is the question of, is QAnon a religion? If you see discourse going on online about QAnon, you'll frequently see people referring to it as a religion, where Donald Trump is essentially the god or the deity of the religion. And a lot of people will say how, in 20 years from now, QAnon will just be another one of the religions alongside Christianity, Mormonism, Scientology, so on and so forth. So I really wanted to pick that apart and talk to some people, who have expertise in this, including James Beverley, who's spent 40 years studying religion, and really ask the question, does QAnon have the component parts of being a religion, and is there a potential for it to sort of shift over time into just becoming another mainstream religion? Looking at what QAnon is and what it's been able to do, it's almost like, if we could actually like coordinate with people and you know, find a level playing field with people on a larger scale for like a much more positive, constructive topic or issue, I almost feel like that would be a good thing, because like you were just saying, like there are a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, you know, within QAnon, and a lot of times those things are sort of like not necessarily focused on. They're not specific. They've like edged away they've scraped away some of the edges, and they've left them a little bit more like, this isn't specifically anti-Semitic, but it's got like the generic tropes of it. But then, like, there are pockets of QAnon where they lean more heavily into the anti-Semitic tropes, and they really do, like, mention them and talk about the protocols and stuff. But then there's other, you know, Q members that are Jewish, and like, they like coexist in this weird way where they almost like, it's not that they're being hidden from one another. In some cases they are, but like, you know, there are people who talk in like the more dark pockets of the internet that other like more mainstream QAnon believers just don't even know about. But there are some QAnon believers that do know about that stuff, and I guess they're just like they're willing to like look past it, suspending
disbelief, just like people would who were you know, embracing you know, and this may get me in a little bit of trouble, but I'm going to say it anyway, embracing Mormonism at its outset when it began with Joseph Smith, and, you know, looking into being a seer. And there was a, you know, seer stone in a hat that he used to predict the future. And eventually that led to him finding the tablets that really have never been verified as architecturally accurate documents of any kind, or the tablets don't exist, or they do, that they have them in Salt Lake City, that they don't have them. That's not important anyway. His testimony following those situations are more important. So it's kind of, you can look at the development of new religions, and some are benign, who've grown out of bizarre beliefs, and others are destructive. So when we look at some of the QAnon ideas, you know, one of them I read about was that there's a reptilian race that's coming from the border south of us, and they're sneaking into the country, and they've already mated with humans. And so the reptilian race, who are really more interested in undermining our democracy, our constitution, and the government, had been sneaking in and mating with humans for many, many years. And this is an old conspiracy theory that goes way back. David Icke. And so David Icke has become current again. Some of his ideas have been absorbed into the Q world, and it gives new birth to that which is already unproven.
The thing that I've been kind of mulling over this whole time is, like, I got raised in a very Christian conservative environment, and the kind of dogmatic call to arms was that something that was deemed as unjust or unchristian or whatever was of the world, in air quotes. And I see that same mentality in a lot of QAnon believers, where it's kind of like, we have our little fiefdom, and then it's us, and it's just very basic, you know, ones and zeros, us versus them mentality. But the religious dogma just filters down everywhere. That idea of the world, and that there is the rest of everyone is wrong, and we, the sacred flock, have the answer. And even the things that don't make sense to us are a part of that greater plan, like the idea of blind faith, where it's hardwired into the religion that it's not going to make sense. So when you do come up against things like children with leukemia, it's like, well, it's all part of the plan. It's like, it's so one-to-one how religion and you know, these, what I experienced, I'm not saying all religions are this way, although low-key all religions are this way. You know, what I experienced was very dogmatic and very pressurized.
What is that meme on TikTok? For legal reasons, this is a joke, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I mean, you can take it a step further. I mean, religion has a massive role in QAnon, and I think it's often under discussed. I mean, when I go to these events, I mean, people are quoting the Q drops interspersed with scripture. They are, I mean, like, and often, I mean, it appears to appeal, particularly in the case of like Christian sects that really go for like a visceral feel of religion. Pentecostals are often very big into QAnon. This idea that like the devil is a real guy, and he is like out there and there's a war that's on, and like you have been conscripted into this war. And so, I mean, and that really fits really right in with that. I mean, you know, there's like a QAnon church out there, that really just gets right into it. So, I mean, really like religion and particularly like evangelical Christianity has a massive role. Yeah. I mean, it really like, it really just plays a huge role in QAnon that these guys, I mean, they think that, I mean, it's like obviously the most important thing you can do if you know, is fighting the devil. And they think that their belief in QAnon is playing into that.
There's a lot of discussion about QAnon, and, you know, a lot of it has various weights of legitimacy. Some of it is a little bit off base. Some of it maybe even a little bit toxic and not really the right way of approaching or thinking about it. And some of those concepts are things like, oh, QAnon is a cult. QAnon is, you know, is a terrorist faction. So all these different things that have been talked about. And what I have wanted to do with some of these interviews and some of the research I've done is try to get a more balanced and objective viewpoint on how accurate some of these things are, or what percentage of these things are true or possible. And one of those things, which I would be interested in talking to you about, is this idea that QAnon is a religion or has the potential to become a religion. That's a thing that people say a lot, is like, you know, QAnon is just, you know, Mormonism in its early stages, or whatever things you hear people saying on Twitter or whatever. So I guess my first question is, you know, in the QAnon deception, you spend, you know, a good deal of the book early on talking about the origins of QAnon. So, you know, in your studies and in your expertise, do you see any similarities between the early formation of QAnon and the early formation of religion, whether it's a specific religion or just religion in general?
All things being equal, I wouldn't call QAnon a religion. I would say more it's a political ideology, not so much a religion. Now it has a flavor of religion to it, like the devotion to Q, the view that the Q material is almost like a Bible. You know, you go study all the Q drops, but that can be overstated. It's largely a political movement that's radically pro-Trump. If you wanted to use the word cult about it, I would only think that applies if you want to talk about Trump is a cult leader and he has a cult following. But again, you don't mean religion there, because Trump professes to be a Christian, but his motif, his modus operandi is political and social, not religious. So I don't think the religion angle with QAnon is that helpful. What people usually mean by cult is a small group that's really wacky. You know, that's how we use the word. A group has to be really strange, at least to outsiders, and then we use the cult word. So that's useful to some degree, but I think it's better to view it as a radical, pro-Trump, pro-Republican political ideology that has some of the trappings of a religion, like the veneration of Trump. But, you know, in all my talking to people over 5 years about Trump, I've only met one person who didn't recognize that he had major faults. I was on a radio show once with the host, and I said, we all know that Trump has his failings, and this radio host said she didn't think he had any. Well, that's not what the vast majority of people realize. Well, in fact, I just read Cliff Sims' book, Team of Vipers, about his 500 days working for Trump. One thing I liked about the book is he was an equal opportunity guy. He criticized Trump where it was relevant and true, and he praised him where he deserved it. And he did the same thing with media or with Republican and Democrat leaders. So I don't want to go the religion angle that much, unless you include QAnon as part of the Trump cult. One of my friends, Steve Hassan, he wrote a book called The Cult of Trump, where he argued that, the obvious, Trump is a cult leader and his followers are culty.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on kind of the head that I was expecting you to. Because that's really, you know, I want to investigate it and talk to people and get their perceptions and their perspectives. I don't want to load the conversation too much, but in my time researching this, that's basically what I've kind of hit upon, is that a lot of these ways that we refer to it are not necessarily helpful. They can come from very emotional places of like getting in a fight with somebody on the internet that's into QAnon and calling them a cult member, or, saying that QAnon is just a new religion where Trump is God or whatever. But that they're not from an analytical standpoint, they're not accurate, and they're not necessarily the most constructive way forward in dealing with QAnon.
Right. Well, calling people names doesn't usually help reconciliation or settle issues.
So do you think that given time and maybe some like contextual removal from the creation of it, that it could turn into a religion?
That's a great question. I definitely think it could sort of be like an expansion pack onto evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, so you can play Star Fox 64.
Yeah, exactly. It's the DLC. I mean, it's the you hear from these pastors who, even very conservative ones, who say that it's just sort of like infiltrated, like they call it a heresy, in that just suddenly people will be saying, mentioning underground military bases like in QAnon, or these pedophile cabals and stuff, and they're like, why is this, how is this in my church now? And so I think in that way it's kind of been tacked onto what we'd recognize as religion.
What do you think draws people to QAnon so strongly that they'll give up relationships with family members, they'll lose their jobs, they'll become isolated, they'll have no friends or family? What draws people to it so strongly?
I wish I had one answer for you. And I think it is, again, getting back to that individual, that, there a lot of the people who have been exposed to these ideas had tendencies toward extremist thought, or something was stimulated in them that might have been dormant, and yet it gave an opportunity to realize those goals. Or those feelings of alienation. I mean, in that sense, the people who we've been talking to, there have been letdowns in their life in some way. Some have had trouble with government agencies reviewing their books and found them to be, questionable. Some have been, we're out in California and began to be sick of the woke culture. They were center left, and they became right as a result of their response to the woke culture. Now, that reactionary position, it's not anyone's fault that people don't just become, lose their job and begin to smoke pot all the time and get involved with Q because somebody says something that they're not woke enough. There's no excuse in that. But some people, that's been their reason. So it's so individual. And, there's a housewife who's become, absorbed in the ideas, and a woman who was for the last 40 years a doctor, a medical doctor, who's now anti-vax and embracing Q ideologies. So how does that happen, and why does it happen, and how long will it last? To some extent, it'll last as long as it's useful. And when it's no longer useful, people can tend to fall away from it. But the ability of a family to stay, even if only peripherally connected to that individual while they're going through this, in many ways, psychological crisis in relationship to the ideas. It's just that this is the convenient methodology for them to go through crisis. And, there were some people that have had previous histories with depression and manic depression and, substance abuse. And so it's so different person to person, how they get involved, why they stay involved, and how deeply they get involved. So And so there's no easy answer there as far as looking at solutions, broadly for the people who are attracted to these ideologies. And I think it's, the whole nature of social media, everybody's kind of, it's become everybody's bad boy. And, do you limit it? Do you, how responsible are they? Well, what about, freedom of association and freedom of ideology? What part does that play in limiting people's ability to hear bullshit on the web? So these are all the questions that come up, and they're very complicated questions with no simple solutions. The cults present simple solutions. Here it is, lay it out. It's all those pedophiles over there. Stay away from the Democratic Party, because if they're not pedophiles, they're supporting pedophiles tacitly by raising money for their campaign or wearing a campaign button for that particular individual who's promoting these ideologies. And, they connect Epstein, abortion, Q drops, crumbs. It all gets swept up into that same wave of thinking.
And the next thing to discuss with the guest is really the big question, the most important question of this entire topic, which is QAnon a cult? And the reason why I think this is so important is because, number one, I just think that's an important thing to discuss, whether or not it is a cult or not. But also, it seems to be the main thing that is used in the discourse and the discussion about QAnon, and a lot of things in general. I think in modern discourse on social media primarily, we have taken to this sort of dynamic where if you disagree with somebody, the thing that we tend to say to people is that they're in a cult. We've pathologized opinions to this point where we now other people who don't agree with us in some major way as being in a cult. And, both people from all political spectrums do this. You see it from conservatives a lot. You see it from liberals a lot. And, you even see it from sort of the more like far left progressives, calling people of another ideological spectrum in a cult, or having been radicalized, or having, being unhinged in some way. There's this general speculation about the mental health of people if they are in some kind of in-group that you're not in. So, it's this kind of general thing, but very specifically with QAnon, in particular, QAnon critical people and people who follow the QAnon movement from a critical perspective tend to engage with QAnon followers in this way where they will mock them and say that they're in a cult. And so, the big question here is QAnon a cult? Is that an accurate assessment of what QAnon is? And what does it mean for us to engage in discourse with them in that way? Is it helping? Is it hurting? What is the efficacy of going around accusing people of being in a cult, in removing them from that belief system? Another focus in your book is kind of tackling the cult question of like, is it a cult? Is it not a cult? What does it even mean to call it a cult? And I think before you even get into the question of is QAnon a cult, I think that a lot of people can recognize that, like, in the greater sort of social media discourse, words like cult kind of like lose their meaning over time because people just like throw them out as just like they just say them in any situation, and then they slowly lose their power, and then it just becomes you saying like, oh, you say somebody's in a cult whenever you're just saying like, oh, what you're saying is crazy or whatever. It just loses its meaning.
Right.
So,
or you're really devoted to something. You hear about like the cult of Apple and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I mean, in researching for your book and what you were able to put together and the people that you were able to talk to, where'd you kind of land on that in terms of like, number one, whether or not it's fair to classify QAnon as a cult or potentially a cult, and then number two, like how you should engage with that idea of it being a cult. Is that like how do you approach that?
Sure. And it's a really, really difficult question. And I wanted to talk to people who are in the field of cults and are in the field of religious extremism to try to get their take. Like, am I just like overthinking it by sort of being ambivalent about it? And everybody I talked to was like, yeah, it's mostly a cult, but then there are ways that it's really not. And I do think that term, like a lot of terms in that world, it just doesn't, it's so overused and applied to so many different things. And it really, it doesn't mean a lot. And of course, when we say cult, we think Manson family. We think, people in beige frocks who are brainwashed and have given up all their possessions and worship the leader. It's a little more complicated than that. I think there are absolutely aspects of QAnon that you will find in any cult-like movement. The in-group versus out-group, the concept of love bombing, the idea that the outside world is this terrifying place and the people who are in the group will protect you and keep you safe and really know what's going on, and the people outside it are just dangerous and your enemy and hate you. That stuff is all basic cult. But at the same time, it doesn't have a charismatic leader. It doesn't have that person at the very top whose word is ironclad. A lot of Q believers will be like, oh, yeah, we're the only cult that teaches you to think for yourself. And in some ways, that's kind of correct, because Q as an internet poster is not particularly charismatic and really is always encouraging people, oh, don't take my word. Think for yourself. Do your research. Cults don't do that. Cults are the opposite. Cults are like, no, only listen to me. I'm the only one who knows what's going on. And no matter how outlandish this sounds, how bizarre this seems to you, it's right because I said it's right. And of course, the indoctrination process is, well, anything that person says is right, no matter how bizarre it is. So it's very cult-like in a lot of aspects, but I think there are aspects of it that is not really a cult. I mean, if you want to call it a cult, I don't think you're wrong, but I don't know if you are exactly right either.
Do you think there's any value in making that comparison at all? Or is it just kind of like an apples and oranges thing that people have just kind of latched onto because it's an easy insult?
I think it's the thing that people have really latched onto. And it's hard to argue about it because if you look at it, it really looks like a cult. I mean, it really, really seems like that. And it is in a lot of ways. So it's one of those things where you're kind of arguing about a definition rather than really talking about the parts of QAnon that are really important, which is why are people into this? What problem does this solve for its believers? I think, arguing about whether it's a cult or not, whether it's a psyop or not, whether it's an alternate reality game or not, at that point, you're really just sort of arguing what the dictionary definition is. And a lot of people who come to QAnon through those particular worlds, cult expertise, alternate reality games, military intelligence, whatever, they look at it through that lens. And I think Q is so complicated that it's not any one thing. And of course, that makes it much harder to define. And things that are hard to define are hard to talk about.
Do you consider QAnon a cult or have the potential to become a cult? If not, why? And what is problematic about labeling it as a cult, if that's the case?
I think people have cultic relationships with ideas that you can have, people who are convert to Catholicism, and then within the Catholic Church, there are cults that are destructive and take over people's lives. We see what developed, in these last 30 years as people came out and said they were sexually abused within the church structure. Yet, I have family members who are still adherents, believe in the church, and feel that, they're against what's happened, and they're encouraged that things are appearing to be cleaned up. So you have cultic thinking, you have cultic relationships with ideas, and that varies depending on the individuals and what they hope to gain from it. And then you have individuals who will take the cultic ideas, form them into a philosophy and a group, create a church, create a political system, a group, an ideology that people can join and actually hook up with. And they usually, the leadership then becomes benefited by that connection as you connect more folks. So it's a tricky word to use to describe QAnon, in that, when like I said, there's usually a pyramid structure. There's a messianic figure at the top, somebody who we can point to began this ideology. Even though, HBO did a special on the source of Q and tried to look at who that might be. And that guy in the Philippines, I'm not clear on his name at this moment, but Ron, the Watkins son and father, they may be the source of it. And, it's not bothering them at all. They seem to revel in their own personal power in the situation. And they may feel that based on their fantasy of the tech world and how they understand it, that this message needs to get out. This becomes the methodology by which we can release it. People are connected via the web. Let's take advantage of the web, and we can sit back and have power and influence. And, people don't even need to look at our personal lives, and that we pick up prostitutes, and that we're not necessarily living a moral, upstanding lifestyle by the standards of, by the way, I'm not judging these people. I'm saying by the standards of many people who consider that to be problematic, who are followers of Q. So, it's really, when you violate the standards of the believer, when it becomes real that the guru is having, relations with followers against his proclamations that this is wrong. So when you see the hypocrisy rising up within that leadership, you can point to it. You can see it. You can have people from the inner circle of that teacher come out and say, "Hey, you guys, this is not what's going on there. This is dangerous. He's lying to you, or she's lying to you." And with Q, it's we play games. We're gamers ultimately. We're joking. We're having fun with this, so they can go back to that. But yet the impact is real, and it's having an effect on real families in our culture, and individuals are getting swept up in that. And the worry is, how extreme are they going to go? Is it going to lead to violence or harm for both the individuals who abide by the theories and ideas of Q and the people who are close to them? So that's where it's cult-like, but you can't say that it's a cult in by definition. Even though it becomes a shortcut for us to talk about the subject. That's why people like Pat Ryan and myself are, people are coming to us with worries about family members. And, I really feel that there's a lot that our experience working with cults can lend to those individuals in learning strategies for dealing with their loved ones. What are we likely to see in the future as this thing develops? How can we kind of limit its effect, its negative effect on the culture and on a family?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and I'm curious, on the subject of, basically everything you were just talking about, the question that I asked you, whether or not QAnon is a cult, and it seems like that's kind of like within the field of expertise of cults or cult-like thinking or cult deprogramming or counseling. It seems like the general consensus is like, I'm hesitant to call this a cult. It's not technically by definition a cult. And I see the point there, and I agree with it that, just, going out to these people and just saying like, you're in a cult is not constructive. It's not going to help. It's a tendency that a lot of people have whenever they're arguing with people on the internet or whatever, and it's just not constructive whatsoever. But I'm curious, because with the classic definition of a cult, that it has a charismatic leader. The thing that always pops into my head is, is this maybe somebody figured out a way to circumvent that, to have a cult where, you know, these people that wanted to spread these ideas and they wanted to gain this following around this, but they weren't a charismatic Jim Jones type guy.
Yeah.
And so they realized that if I obfuscate or obscure that behind creating this online persona and remaining anonymous and building a character for myself, that I could essentially just provide the voice for this charismatic leader that exists entirely digitally online and is not necessarily one literal person, but it's me and a couple of my friends writing dialogue for this person. It kind of makes me think of, you know, a few elements from like Philip K. Dick novels where he dealt with that a lot, of like creating leaders that didn't exist, like the president in the Penultimate Truth, who would beam these messages down to the underground people and say like the war is still raging and there was no war. The president wasn't real. He was a computer generated thing. It makes me kind of think of that. And it makes me wonder, like, is there some wiggle room in there of like, maybe this is a cult, and I'm really just asking this. This isn't loaded. I'm asking your perspective on it, but maybe this is a cult, but they've just redefined what a cult leader is.
Well, I mean, it's a valid question, a question that I think is important to ask. That are we looking at something new? And if we are looking at something new, then we need to have new solutions for the problem. If there is a creation of a group of people in some remote location who themselves aren't charismatic, yet they create a charismatic entity, because what charisma is for one person may not be for another. I mean, you know, you think of a 70s rock star and a 2000s rapper, you know, very different, you know, looking, feeling, cultural icons, yet both are cultural icons that are embraced and absorbed and enjoyed by millions. So creating what is charisma is something that can be generated. And I think, you know, knowing how to contend with that is something that's going to be an important part of our future discussions on this issue. That the social psychologists and others who study these issues are beginning to put out their opinions. And for the most part, what I see when people are discussing Q, who are professionals in the field, it's pretty much the same. It's like sort of like, I don't know. I mean, there's almost a, well, you know, and you need to take it individual by individual. And what for us, it always comes down to in working with individuals who've been affected by extremist ideologies is a relationship between an individual and an individual who they're concerned about. So it's your relationship that becomes essential. So it is that emotion, that emotional connection that you don't want to lose. And you raised that when you said it's never a good idea to walk up to somebody who you feel is affected or in a cult and say, hey, you're in a cult. You know that's going to shut them down. And in many cases, they've been prepared for how they're not like what the definition of cult is, you know, magnifying and focusing on those things that aren't like you and taking your attention away from those things that define a cult. So it's an easy, you know, sleight of hand trick by diverting one's attention from, you know, what we aren't like and what we are. What we aren't like is there's no leader here. There's nobody telling you what to do. They're not telling you have to eat gruel. They're not telling you not to love your wife. They're not telling you to take all your savings and send them to a PO box. At least as far as I know, there may be some individuals who are doing that. But I mean, these are all we're not like a cult. But most cults don't do those extreme things either. The kinds of control are much more nuanced, which is the majority of groups that eventually people get in trouble with, like NXIVM. I don't know if you've looked at all into the group NXIVM. The leader, Keith Raniere, you know, is serving 120 years in prison for sex trafficking and his antics with that organization. 16,000 people, including Branson, took his training. they weren't in a cult, but yet he had a core group who were branded eventually, to show their love and support for the source, the great leader. So this is what we find when we're looking at, both groups that splinter off of larger concepts and ideologies and become cultic, and the ideology itself, which people can dip into and dip out of, and not be really radically affected by that. And that, in most cases, is the majority. So, I don't know that many of the people whose families have called me and are concerned are people who are, they live a very comfortable life. Most of these people who are, at least the ones we've come in contact who seek us out for help. The followers are, they're living a cushy middle-class American existence, but this has become their cause, and they feel like now that the kids are grown and, or I'm an empty nester, or, I need to make a difference in the world before I go. These are the people that are attracted to the philosophy, but they already, most of them, but not all, have a politically right-leaning, at least in the beginning they did. But now we're seeing where the anti-vax movement, leftists and progressives and New Agers who, didn't trust government to begin with and followed certain channelers and spirit guides in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. These ideas are coming to the fore in Q as well.
I think QAnon, obviously it's been one of the first really mainstream examples of conspiratorial thinking and cult-like thinking. Well, maybe not cult-like thinking, but definitely conspiratorial thinking. Like, I feel like this is the first time that a lot of people have been introduced to these sort of like conspiracy theory movements that was presented to them in a serious way, that wasn't just like, oh, these crazy people who think that there was a second shooter for JFK. Like, that exists in a different mind space of like, there's some wackos out there that think this. But this was presented for the first time, I think, in popular consciousness as like this real thing that's scary, and things are happening because of that. So I think because of that, a lot of people really think that this is like a brave new world. This is like the world has changed. This is an example of how we've gone downhill, or whatever it is. So I guess my first question in this sort of line of thinking is, exactly how true is that in experience? Exactly how unique is QAnon, or is it, similar to, is it similar to a lot of cults and conspiracy movements that have come in the past that just might have, we just don't know about because the internet didn't exist or people just weren't paying attention?
Well, I think there were various movements that existed. I mean, there were so many various end times movements that existed previous to QAnon. And QAnon doesn't necessarily see itself as an end times movement. It tries to be, for some people, an activist movement, where we need to take action. And I see that in some of the families who've called me, where their loved ones have become active, attacking school boards in their local communities, going after Black history, and the connection between, children feeling bad and the fact that the races are a lot better off than they would have been had we, not gone through. We did the Emancipation Proclamation. That should be enough. That systemic racism doesn't exist, and so they go before a school board, and their philosophy is tied to the QAnon philosophy. So real time, how these mass movements, make effect. It really does take, when we look at a cult, we look at a pyramid structure, a self-appointed leader at the top, and lots of information, different information given out at different levels of that pyramid. So you have many members who don't know what's going on up at the core, meaning you have a bunch of people adhering to the beliefs of Q without knowing maybe Q is a pedophile. I mean, maybe he's just trying to hide in plain sight. Maybe he's doing a deflection. We don't know who he is. At least in cultic groups, as they've manifested in the past, we were able to define who leadership was. Even if the leader eventually dies and the group continues, you can usually nail down in time and place who this individual was. But the fact that it's a shadowy figure, and that's acceptable to the kinds of people who are middle class, upper middle class Americans who promote patriotic values, is something a little bit different. And when we look at cult groups, we often look at, what is it? What's taking place? That's called what changes are being elicited by the belief system. So, if you're believing in angels and the New Age, people proclaim that they see the angels, and they see them if they stare. For example, at a friend. And if you stare at anything for a given period of time or a long period of time with your eyes open, you're going to see the light change around that person. You could call it a halo. You could have a great memory and imagine it to be the angel coming down and sitting with that person. I see your angel. Therefore, you're blessed. Or this is what you need to encourage in your life. You need to eat more of this, or be more of that way, or chant this phrase more often. But with QAnon, it's so disparate that in some ways it's more dangerous. And the things I feel that could be done, and this is just me as speaking as Joe Kelly, an individual who's speaking on their own, is that the leadership that does exist, that the people of Q look up to, have not stepped up to discount the insanity. They have not stepped up and said, this is completely false. There's no proof of this. I am not the Messiah. And what they're proclaiming I'm going to be able to do, giving these false dates as to when I'll be taking over again or whatnot, what these various landmarks or goalposts that have not been met. When the prophecy fails, what do? What does leadership do? It ignores it, because again, when you go to a rally of certain groups, the Q people are there, and they're there in force, and they're there in order to promote more of the ideology that leadership sees that is valuable for them. So I can get a group of people together, 20,000, 30,000, to promote my agenda. Who cares if they're a little wacky? At least they're following me, and they're listening to me, and they're voting for me. And therefore, that's my only concern. It's a very self-centered and, ultimately, fascistic point of view, and quite dangerous. And if it doesn't, somehow the myth isn't dispelled. Most of these things do run a course for individuals. It doesn't mean they don't get new adherents, but over the course of time, 90% of the people that get involved with extremist ideologies leave them. But we're concerned for the 10% who stay connected, and how extreme are they willing to get? How far are they? How much dehumanization is going to take place? You're a Democrat, therefore you're a pedophile and a baby eater. I have a right to kill you. How far will this go for certain individuals? And that remains a concern. How this thing plays out, we don't know. There's so much that we don't know.
I do actually consider them to be cults. I think for all the reasons that I just mentioned about what to watch out for, but also that there is this great defensiveness, and I think also regression that happens, that I see a lot when people get involved in cult-like groups, where families will say, I can't talk to my loved one anymore. They're being highly insulting about me even asking a question about this group or doubting it. They are digging their heels in even more. They can't entertain even a calm discussion that somehow I'm attacking the group or their supreme leader or truth. And that is very cult-like. where people will say, I had a 30-year-old relative who got in, and now I feel like I'm talking to a 14-year-old who's like, you can't tell me what to do, has that kind of tone to it. And I don't mean to be insulting, but it has that kind of like, how dare you even question me? So in that way, it's cult-like. And I think also because there is kind of a hangover similar to cult indoctrination that you see afterwards, where people will have a very hard time letting go of the high and letting go of the whole community that's built around it, and that these are your true friends. And also people leave still wondering about the things that were the fear induction kind of topics, and wondering if those things are now going to come true, that if they failed the world in some way or failed the mission. That's also very cult-like, that you can't make a clean break. They kind of make sure of it emotionally that you can't make a clean break.
Yeah, just to inject a little bit of my opinion into this for a second, the thing that I've found interesting is, with a lot of the discussion, and it's stuff I've read, but it's also people that we've interviewed, with some of the people who argue, that QAnon is not a cult, or couldn't necessarily be considered a cult. I feel like a lot of the times the argument that I've read or seen made is that it's almost kind of more of a semantic argument, that it couldn't be technically considered a cult because it doesn't fulfill all of the bullet points of what is considered a cult on official basis. So the fact that it doesn't have a charismatic leader. And the thing that I've found interesting about that, the thing that to me sticks out to me as like kind of weird about that argument, is that QAnon doesn't technically have a charismatic leader in the traditional sense that you think of when you think about a cult, but couldn't that just mean that these people who have engineered and orchestrated this have sort of figured out a way around that aspect of it? Because you're looking at this at an attempted objectively, you have a bunch of these people who are not charismatic. They are not leadership types. They are these sort of like internet message board, possibly teenagers who want to have this sort of like online power and sway over people, but they are not somebody who could go out and like start proselytizing to crowds. They don't have that charismatic manipulative power. And so in the lack of that, they figured out a way to create a charismatic force that they could embody from, behind a computer. So that's the thing that kind of sticks out to me about that argument of like QAnon isn't a cult because of this technical thing, is, that just to me sounds like somebody has figured out a way to evolve the definition of what a cult is.
Right. It's an interesting thing when you go over the definition of a cult, because actually there are a lot of cults that will define what a cult is and what it isn't. And so a lot of people I've talked to, hundreds already at this point, who talk about this particular thing, where they will say they really trusted the organization or the person who was running it, because one of the first things they did was define, pardon me. So one of the first things they did was define how they're not a cult. And of course, they found a way to define it in a different way, so that you could say, oh yeah, this is different from that. And usually groups like QAnon will say that a cult needs to have a leader, or that they need to have a place where everyone meets. They will make sure to show where they can differentiate themselves from the definition of a cult and say, see, this proves that we're not that. But, a cult isn't necessarily about having a leader, and it's not necessarily about having lots of people or a place where you meet or a compound. There are what we sometimes call one-on-one cults. People will contact me and say, I think I was in a cult of two. I had lost myself. And so oftentimes they're with people who are delusional or people who are malignant narcissists, where they really lose their own sense of self and become kind of the emotional servant for somebody else, and lose track of reality. and join someone else's reality who is very good at manipulating. But with QAnon, to not get so mired, I think, in the definition of if it's a cult or not, because they'll argue the points about how we might define it. It is still interesting, I think, to talk about the leadership being different. And so if there is a leader, and there usually is, it's just that the leader didn't show themselves, for a while. But that actually adds to the mystique. Because when you don't see the wizard, you can deify him or her or whoever it is and assume then they're something that they might not be because you need for them to be. And so it actually can make them much more powerful and have sort of much more mystical, kind of a mystical aura or grandiosity or perfection to them, wondering if they're somehow superhuman in some way because you've never seen them. And then when they give out their missives and their coded, undecipherable at times messages, which is actually very cult-like, a lot of cult leaders don't make sense. And it's actually quite crazy making. And people will be left with this sort of word salad and think, I have to decipher this. And you'll also be told if you don't understand it, it's because you're not trying hard enough, or you haven't come to enough meetings or enough services or donated enough money. And you're not opening your heart and your mind to this, but it is really that it doesn't make sense. People only upon leaving a cult who look over the teachings will say, actually, I tortured myself and I let myself be tortured for years trying to decipher these things. And now that I look at it, it actually doesn't make sense, and maybe on purpose to drive people crazy. But because then you have this deification of this person who is Q, whatever they send out, no matter if it makes sense or not, you put it together like it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. It has this utmost importance, and you think it's somehow going to change the world. Yeah,
there's that video that has just been passed around on the internet for a long time, long before the court trials or the arrests or whatever, but of the Nexium guy sitting down talking to Allison Mack, and he's talking to her. And he said, the video is like 4 minutes long or whatever it is. And for like 3 minutes or so, he just speaks literal gibberish. Mm-hmm. Like the things he's saying do not have meaning. And then she starts crying. Uh-huh. Like what he said, it literally is just gibberish. I find that so fascinating and deeply disturbing. Right. I remember one time, every once in a while, someone will alert me to a particular group. And if it's sort of in the area that I'm living in, I'll go to check it out. And if they ask for your name and address right away, I'll give them whatever name and address pops into my head. It's usually whatever movie I happen to see. Because really they shouldn't have access to my information. And it's actually a good lesson for people moving forward that just because someone asks you a question doesn't mean you have to answer it. So, just good in life, period. But, I've sat there and, seen the same thing where the leader will get up, or a sub leader, someone who is a kind of a group head, will get up and talk about things being like, well, what was the latest one that I heard? We are dancing in the listening for possibility. Okay. So everyone started clapping. And I thought, wow, that's not English. But it moved everyone in the room because of the way it was said, and because they had been taught that if they didn't get it, they were going to be called on the carpet. Anyone who wasn't cheering and didn't seem excited was then kind of pointed to. Looks like you're not getting it. Looks like you're not really here with us with this. And so people don't want to be the only one in the room to not get it. So this is a reassuring message for anyone who goes into situations like this, where you think you're the only one who is not getting it because you're not cheering. You're just the only one not faking it.
Most of the people in the room have no idea what that person said either, but they have learned, they've been there long enough to know they're going to be called on the carpet unless they pretend that they got it. So you're never the only one in the room who doesn't understand.
Is there sort of like a best practices list of early signs or red flags that the organization that you're in might be a cult, or that or like an extremist conspiratorial movement, or that a friend might be in a cult? Are there like a list of kind of like red flags or signs that you want to look out for?
Yes. So there are a number of them. So I think that it's good to watch out, first of all, to see if it says that it is the truth, that there is no other truth. It is the only way. It is the right way. You have this with some Bible-based groups. You have this with some multi-level marketing groups that tell you this is the only way to be able to really make your riches and be able to pay your bills. But it's also true if you get involved in anything that says, thank goodness you found us, because there isn't anything else that's going to help you in the same way, or that has its finger on the pulse of the answers to everything, and we are your only way. That's when you want to find the door. The other thing is that you can also get answers to everything that you've ever questioned, and it tells you it's the source of all of your answers. The dichotomy there, though, is that they won't answer your questions about the group. And if you are having some doubts, like, well, prove to me that you actually have all the answers, or that you've saved people's lives, or that you've saved all these children, like in QAnon, they will find a way to not answer the question and to put it back on you, that there's something wrong and negative about you in your doubting spirit and in your inability to just have faith in them. So while they have all the answers, they won't have the answers to your questions about them. Also, a lot of times people will say in retrospect, they were made to sign things. They were made to sign non-disclosure agreements. They were made to sign other kinds of forms and pushed into it to really that took their rights away of being able to share what happened to them. You don't want to sign anything when you first get involved in anything, and show it to an attorney. And if they say you don't have time for that, and if you delay, then you'll be proving that that part of you that doubts these sorts of things really is the thing that's getting in your way. Then they're just trying to get you to put your signature on something you haven't perused first. The other thing is that a lot of these groups are manufactured to create fervor. So if you find that you're suddenly feeling high, that you're suddenly feeling what they call love bombed, if you're suddenly feeling like these people now care about you more than anyone else, and they see great things for you, and it's been 10 minutes, then you also want to find the door, because that's also a situation that's been created to make you not think and not engage your critical thinking, because you're so instead in this period of or system of awe that has been dramatized so that you don't think, so that you don't question. I think it's also true that when you are involved in something, or potentially getting involved in something that can't be trusted, they will not take no for an answer. They won't even take maybe for an answer. You have to believe it. You have to be willing to sign up. You have to be willing to make a commitment right away. And you can't say, you know what, let me think about it, because then you'll either be rejected or you'll be insulted for doing that. You also are not allowed to research it online from any other sources, which is true of cult groups too. People in cults know the least amount of information about them. And so they're the ones actually, in terms of, QAnon will often tell me I have my blinders on, but usually they're the ones, or people inside these systems are the ones who have blinders on, and they're not allowed to even talk to people who have left to find out why they've left, to get other input from people who became disenchanted and or harmed by it. And then also fear mongering. If you don't get involved now, something bad will happen to you. If you don't commit yourself to this, then if something bad happens to the world, you'll be responsible for it, or at least in part responsible for it. If you don't take advantage of this offer now, it'll never come up again. And none of those things are ever true. And so you want to be careful about that level of pressure. It's a hard sell and hard sales tactic, even if it's coming actually in spiritual form. And also too much forced intimacy. Tell us about your life. Tell us about your marriage. Tell us about all the things that have not gone right in your life or your biggest fears. There is, again, this created sense of closeness. These are people who really understand me. This happens with these large group awareness trainings, sort of EST style trainings, where you have to immediately sit around and talk about what you want to have written on your tombstone. And you haven't taken your purse off yet. And I think also there's secrecy that's encouraged, where they will say, listen, while you will be expected to tell us everything, you really shouldn't share this with other people on the outside because they won't understand and they'll try to take it away from you. And that's the way these groups continue doing things that they shouldn't for a long time, because they stay in the shadows and they get your participation in keeping them in the shadows. And they also have their own language, suddenly a different kind of lingo that they speak that might be English, but it sounds a little different. And the definitions are different. It's like Scientology has its own dictionary. It's English, but not, right? And this idea of he speaks my language or she speaks my language is a very unifying force. And it also disconnects you from the people outside who no longer, quote unquote, speak your language. And then I guess one last thing, I could go on with a lot of things to watch out for that I've seen over these many years, but you want to see if there's a governing body. If something goes wrong, if you're put in harm's way, or if you're made promises that don't come true, can you report this to anyone? Or are they this renegade group that operates on its own? There are a lot of people who have come to me, and I know this might be controversial, but a lot of people come to me who have been in 12-step programs where something has really gone awry based on who was there at the time. It's not to say all 12-step is bad, but if something bad happens, there's nobody to go to complain about it, to protect yourself. And so if this is an organization that is part of a larger organization that has like an ethics board or a human resources department, then you're a lot safer. But if it's just some person in their garage who started this or online or thought that they're the Messiah, and they don't operate under the auspices of anything else, then you are completely at their mercy.
And so now that we've discussed sort of the questions of the what is QAnon, now the next available topic of discussion, or the next logical step in our understanding of QAnon is, how do we deal with it? What do we do about this thing? How do we interact with it? How do we stop it or solve it or salve it? And is the thing that we're doing now moving us in a positive direction, or is it just pushing us further into a negative direction that's just making the problem worse and worse?
What do you think the best way to deal with QAnon is, moving forward, both, on a personal level with people that you might know, who believe in this movement, and just in a general, larger scale sense in terms of society?
Yeah, on a personal scale, my main advice to people who have a friend or a family member who is deep into conspiracy theories is to find a way to get them away from the computer, because this is just something that that's just all consuming. It's like an addiction. And like they need, and often it fills a void, and it helps them feel a sense of purpose in a way that they can't get elsewhere. And so they need to find anything else. Going for a hike, playing, Settlers of Catan, just anything else in this world that they can find enjoyable and fulfilling, because that's the main draw of these sorts of conspiracy theories, is that It makes you feel like you're a hero, like you're a digital soldier, like you're important, like you're part of the vanguard that's helping change the world, right? And the thing is that I can present people with facts about why their beliefs are nonsense. I can't give them that feeling like they're a hero, right? And this is why they often choose QAnon over facts. On a more society-wide scale, I have to say, man, I'm pretty stumped. I know it's kind of a unfulfilling answer, but we have an issue where we have, like literally millions of people who believe this. I mean, I think it would take things that are unthinkable. For example, it would take Donald Trump saying QAnon is nonsense and no one should believe it, and no one who supports Trump should also support QAnon. I think that would put a big dent in it. But the thing is that Trump will never do that, because at the end of the day, he would never denounce someone who passionately supports him.
Yeah, you've just given me an interesting idea with your talk about how it makes them feel like heroes. We did an episode of our show recently about this thing that happened in the early 2000s where these two college students, they threw this 3-year-long prank / augmented reality game on this 19-year-old kid, where they concocted this fake world where he was the hero and savior of humanity that was going to save us from a robot apocalypse that was going to happen in the future. And they did all these scavenger hunts and games for him, and they kept sending people to give him clues, and it happened over 3 years, and then it eventually all culminated in them leading him to this theater where they did this rock opera where he was the main character, and this whole musical happened around him. So basically what we have to do is we have to throw one of those for every single QAnon supporter. We have to do one of those for all of them, and we could eradicate this in a couple decades.
That's it. Yes, it's a ambitious project. We need an alternate reality game specifically tailored to every single QAnon follower. It would take $20 billion in 2 decades, but I think we could do it.
Yeah, we got to get a non-pedophile Jeffrey Epstein type to take interest in this and help fund us. So we just got to make sure he's not a pedophile, because I feel like that would throw a wrench in our narrative if he was a pedophile.
Come on, Jeff Bezos, you squinty-eyed looking motherfucker. Let's do this.
Let's do it, Jeffy.
It's good to be conscious of we're going to need 2 approaches. And so at the personal level, I hear several times a week from people who say, I've lost my friend, my relative, whatever, to QAnon, and it's starting to affect my life in very negative ways. They won't get vaccinated, whatever. And it's really hard. I mean, I've talked to people who have gotten very frustrated with the, so-called advice that's out there, because often it sort of takes in, it expects you to have the skills of a therapist, a researcher, all this kind of stuff, and sort of this endless patience that you can just sit there and argue with this person all day. I do think, the best advice I've seen is to avoid confronting them about QAnon directly, and to sort of maintain this relationship, to try to take them out of QAnon if possible, to do anything that's not related to QAnon, to go for a walk, and now that the pandemic's ending, hopefully, ideally that's easier, just to take them out to a restaurant, to get them away from the internet, essentially. And then, but typically, I mean, people leave QAnon because they have their own epiphanies usually. And they see that something Q claimed, kind of a tenet or with a Q proof that for them was very effective, they realized was wrong. And so typically it's kind of you maintaining the relationship until they reach that point. Now, if it's someone you're related to, you probably do care to put in that effort. If it's some random person, often it's who cares? But yeah, I mean, I think that's the best advice personally.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely on an individual basis have engaged people in that way. But like you said, it's exhausting. It's there's not enough time in the world for people to devote their entire lives to trying to de-radicalize every individual person, on a person by person basis. And also, there's just all these questions of these ethical questions of putting the emotional labor onto a person to educate people when they could be spending their time doing anything else that's more helpful to society in a larger scale. But but it also feels like you can't just like pipe out generic like QAnon is wrong, like it's all bullshit, because that just gets interpreted as like the Mockingbird media, like
right. What are they so scared of? Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a hard. It's like I don't. There's no like right clear path. I mean, I don't think there's like a clear path for anything in the broader perspective of life or society, but like this in particular just feels like, what the fuck do you do? What do you do?
Yeah, I mean, it is really complicated, and I think, understandably, people kind of want to just be like, "What? How do I get out of this real quickly? Like, what's the blue pill going to be that takes this person out of this?" But as I think Julian Field at QAnon Anonymous has said, and there are these hucksters out there in the same way that there are QAnon hucksters. There are these sort of anti-QAnon hucksters, and so as he said, like if anyone tells you that there's like a silver bullet that's going to get someone out of QAnon, typically that's not the case, and they're trying to sell you something.
Well, that's the biggest thing that could be done against it. If Trump would go public and say, look, I don't like Hillary Clinton, but I don't think she kidnaps babies and tortures them and kills them and drinks their blood. Okay? Or Trump could say, I had my worries with John McCain, but I didn't execute him. Or he could say, no, I don't think Queen Elizabeth is part of the satanic cabal to kidnap children, or the Pope, or the Dalai Lama. So the QAnon world has bought into all these wild theories. It would even help if Trump would say, no, I didn't work with a Q figure high up in the U.S. military. So I hope, one reason I'm more hopeful now than I was, say, 6 months ago is there's some signs that people connected to Trump don't really want to be associated with QAnon. So at one of the big Trump rallies recently, they told people not to have Q flags or give signs that they're into Q.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people I've talked to have basically echoed that, which I think really, one of the things I really wanted to delve into is with this whole thing is like, knowing that there's no silver bullet, there's no one solution, like what needs to happen to start to try to heal this, and whether that's something that we can do or whether it's something that needs to happen that maybe is impossible. But that was kind of what I wanted to get to the heart of. And I've heard that sentiment echoed a lot is like one of the big things that could happen that would immediately make things, a lot better than they are now tomorrow, is if these authority figures, whether it's Trump specifically or a lot of these other politicians, just came out and said it was not real. And instead of what they've done all this time, which is avoid talking about it because they don't want to alienate the followers from being their voters.
But then you have those people who tend to believe those kinds of things anyway. And you have those people who have minor frustrations in their lives. That's why when you look at the QAnon believer, you have to look at the individual. And so many families, call us and say, what do we do? And it really depends. I mean, there's no abracadabra. There's no magic series of words. There's no clear formula because it's an individual's relationship with an idea at a specific time in their life. What else is going on emotionally for that individual that led them to be able to be filled up by such irrational thinking? Many of these people were doctors, lawyers, professionals, business executives who, are embracing Q ideas. So it's not about intellectual ability or acuity. It's about the suspension of belief and the need to fill some part of their emotional life up with this exciting new movement. And I can relate to that as an ex-member of a group that we were on the forefront of building a new society. was referred to then as the Age of Enlightenment. And, there were huge forums held and, thousands of people coming together and Nobel Prize winning physicists who were sitting on the stage with the Maharishi, which gave great credibility to the story. And so the more the movement can gain acceptable adherents who are saying, oh, we don't abide by the white supremacist element of this group. They're not us. We're different than that. We're not part of the anti-Semitic group. We're these people here who are concerned about the welfare of our children and the lies being told by mainstream media. So finding that truth and building their argument by appearing to be mainstream within an extremist ideology has been effective at keeping and maintaining some sense of connection to these ideas, even though you're going to meet, like you said, you'll meet people who are dominionist Christians who believe that, God has granted Christians dominion, over the earth. And therefore they have a right to be in the position of power and influence that they're in. And God has granted them this. And, it's like little folks back there, the ignorant, don't cast pearls before swine. They don't need to know the detail. So we're just going to keep that from them, but we're going to forge ahead and use whatever means is necessary, whatever vehicle is helpful for us to further our political agenda and bring a more Christian America to the fore. So that's where the segue between Christianity and QAnon happens within that dominionist culture, who, whether or not they believe in the detail of some of the ideas, they're able to use it in order to gain adherence and talk more about Christian values, and bring people more to what they consider to be the central theme of their lives and the life that's going to make America great again.
And this whole discussion about how to deal with Q naturally leads into the idea of how we deal with and interact with the people. It's easy to look at QAnon followers as this, it's easy to dehumanize them and look at them as this mass of slobbering, mindless drones that simultaneously are accusing you of being a sheep and not thinking for yourself, while also engaging in this blind faith acceptance of this blatantly incorrect narrative that's being fed to them by a random anonymous person on a message board or through Facebook memes. And as I kind of talked about with the cult thing, it seems like our general approach to this has been mockery and alienation, telling Q people how dumb they are, and telling them that they're in a cult and that they are deranged or they're mentally ill. Before the election, famously during his campaign, Joe Biden told QAnon followers that they needed to seek mental health treatment. So let's really unpack that and talk to our guests about, how do we talk to QAnon people? How do we interact with them? How do we deal with them? And is the thing that we're doing now, which seems to overwhelmingly be mockery, alienation, and kind of giving them the cold shoulder. We're gonna dismiss everything you say out of hand. We're just going to ignore you and your nonsense because it's all just gobbledygook, and we're going to tell you that you're in a cult and that you're crazy and you need to seek help, and then that's going to be the end of it. Is that the right thing to do, or is there a much better path? I think that there's kind of like, there seems to be like a binary in the approach to engaging with QAnon followers or just the movement in general, which is like the idea of empathy versus ridicule, like whether you want to like make fun of these people for just being so, quote unquote crazy or stupid, versus, empathizing with them, or, ignoring them and just kind of being like, that's just some crazy people over there, we can just ignore that, versus like engaging with the movement in some way. And then the third one, I think, is like getting into arguments with them where you're trying to just like prove the thing that they're saying wrong versus like trying to understand why they think it and have a dialogue about them. So I mean, like I said, this is a loaded question, but like which approaches have you sort of come to learn through your research are like the better way of engaging with this if you're going to do it?
Well, and that's, I think, the last thing you said is a really important part of this, if you're going to engage with it. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that if you have a Q believer in your life, there's no need to engage with them about it. If this is just some silly thing that they believe in and they're not hurting themselves, they're not making you feel unsafe, they're not costing themselves money, there's really no reason to pick this battle. It's not going to go anywhere good. And you're really just wasting your time. But if that person is really starting to hurt themselves, cost themselves money, make you or other people in your circle feel unsafe, I would say that the approach of empathy and the approach of letting them know that you're out there and you're a safe harbor for them to talk to about this is much better than any kind of ridicule. That's only going to drive them deeper into the conspiracy, because that's how we work. I mean, if we think something that's wrong and somebody tells us that we're an idiot, we're not going to go, oh, I guess I am an idiot. We're going to go, no, you're an idiot. I'm right and you're wrong, and all you're doing is making me feel like I'm more right. That's the way we all are. Debunking or debating or fact-checking your way out of QAnon is just a fool's game that is never, ever going to work. And it really doesn't work with conspiracy theories in general, because there's always something else they can pull out. There's always some other, there's always some other theory or some other piece of information that well, what about this? What about that? What about this guy who said this? And you can knock those down, but at some point you're just tired of it. You don't want to do it anymore. And you stop and they declare victory, and then you've accomplished nothing. And again, just wasted your time. But if it's really important to try to get somebody out of QAnon, what you want to do is present yourself as a person who they can talk to about things that are not QAnon. You can make it clear you don't want to talk about it. You don't want to talk about Trump. You don't want to talk about the election. You don't want to talk about vaccines. But you want to talk to them about, hey, what's new in your life? How's your job? Did you see the game the other day? Just the anodyne small talk that functional people are able to have with other functional people that Q and conspiracy theory believers tend to not do, because it's not part of this. It's not part of the conspiracy. It's all part of the movie that the deep state wants you to watch. But if you make it clear that, hey, those little things are really important to you and you want to talk about that with them, what happens is you present yourself as a person who, if they start to falter in their belief in Q, if something in it stops making sense, if they find that contradiction, that mistake, that thing that doesn't add up for them, they can talk to you about it, because you will not ridicule them. You will not take it as, hey, I told you so. I was right. And you were an idiot this whole time. Now, you may be thinking that. They may have been an idiot this whole time, but telling them that is not going to get you anywhere that you want to go. It's a very laborious process. And I haven't seen it work that many times. There are very few publicly out Q believers. Now, there are a lot who post on places like QAnon casualties on Reddit, but they're doing it anonymously. Very few will talk to me on the record. They're embarrassed. They kind of can't believe what they got themselves into. But if you do want to start pulling somebody out, that's really the only way that I know of so far to do it.
Yeah, just the pure Beach Boys method. Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Hey, we should all be listening to Pet Sounds and not
yeah, for sure.
not talking about QAnon.
Oh yeah, everything would be solved.
Really would.
Yeah, I mean, I think finding common ground with people and understanding why they believe in QAnon, sort of on a more emotional level, is going to be the more effective one. Obviously, that's probably also the hardest one, and and often for people, I think it's it's one thing for me to be talking to someone I've never met before who's into QAnon, and I'm like, well, okay, I guess they're into QAnon. I think it's often very frustrating. And another thing for people who lost a spouse or a parent to QAnon and who remember what this person was like before they, kind of went off the deep end, and how, hurtful that could be, thinking about how suddenly this sort of facially ridiculous thing has somehow, just kidnapped this person's brain.
Yeah. I feel like I've spent the better part of the last couple of years sort of going down the alternate route where I'm just like, if I can just fucking prove to this person that they're wrong, then they'll get it.
And it's worked a couple times. Like I have actually like convinced a couple people that not that QAnon was wrong, but that this one specific thing that they were saying was not true. But the hits to misses, it just doesn't feel like it works out in the end.
It's a great question because a lot of people, when they come to me to talk about a loved one who's involved in a group, they will say, it's sort of after the fact, they'll say, I think I blew it. I think I said the wrong thing because I seem to make them more angry, or I seem to make them cut off from me or become more secretive and see me as the enemy. The truth is that most people don't do it the wrong way. They do it sort of the natural way, but here these situations dictate a different way of intervening. And that's why it's good to get some guidance. You don't want to fall into a trap that's been set by the person who is running a particular movement. And conspiratorial thinkers will often be taught in this black and white way that anyone who doesn't see what you see is stupid. Anyone who is against you getting involved in this also doesn't really care about you, doesn't care about the world, doesn't care about your safety or their safety, doesn't really love you. It gets taken to that degree. And so it's important then to not come out fighting and to not say, I know more than you do about this group and you need to stop it. So if you can say instead, there is something that you've gotten involved in that I just might not understand. So give me a chance to understand it. Let's have some conversations where you teach me about what you're learning. And also in that, what you'll get is why it's important to them, what it gives them. If it makes them feel special, if it makes them feel less lonely, they'll reveal sometimes what was true for them emotionally that made this speak to them. And then you'll have a sense of really getting to know your loved one a little bit better, not knowing they were suffering with anxiety, not knowing they were suffering with loneliness. Or just for some people, they just really want to be taken seriously. A lot of people I've talked to said, they were the ones sometimes who didn't go to the Ivy League school in their family and really wanted to be taken seriously. So then suddenly they had this piece of intelligence they thought they could share and now seem smarter than their siblings or smarter than someone else. And only come to find that it was dismissed or they were being laughed at or criticized. And that made them kind of dig their heels in more and become louder just to prove something about themselves. Don't put people in a situation where they keep having to prove something about themselves, because you're going to then be forcing them to be taking an even harder line, and they might even be feeling, just because they need to prove that they're right. And so it isn't a competition. It's not about who's right or wrong. And instead to say, I want to understand. And I want you to be able to share with me what you're learning and what you're getting from this, or what you feel I need to know. I won't criticize it. I'll understand, or I'll try to understand why that matters to you. And maybe it's because you care about me, that you want me to believe these things. And then once that person feels heard and respected and understood, they're going to be much more open to hearing you say, okay, thank you for sharing that. And I also have this other piece of information that talks about the group in a different way. Would you be open to looking at that? It's not that I know what's better or that this source is more trustworthy, but let's then do some comparison. And then that's the next step, really helping the person engage their critical thinking, which they will not do if they feel they're being attacked.
Yeah. I think that's been. It's interesting because I see the what you're talking about, the natural way of doing things. I think is a knee-jerk reaction of anybody. Like if somebody is saying some super just insane things, your natural reaction is to just be like, "What are you talking about? Like that's not true." And it's really interesting that the seemingly natural reaction of people is almost a little bit counterintuitive to constructive ways of approaching these things.
And I don't see people really in the greater conversation, whether it's on the internet or just in general. I don't see people really going that path. I see a lot of destructive and sort of counterintuitive reaction to these things that isn't necessarily helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, I will sometimes do, and maybe I shouldn't say this out loud because then my clients who know I've done this to will hear it. But here I go. There are a lot of times that I will think, how would I interact with a child who's having a tantrum? So what I will do, because a lot of the outbursts feel like tantrums. A child really wants to know that they are really upset that they couldn't get a second toy in the toy store. Really, like it's an egregious, awful, like dehumanizing moment. And the world is topsy-turvy. And so when they're crying or laying on the ground and banging their fists on the ground, that's not the time to say, okay, fine, I'll give you another toy. That's the time to say to them, you know what, when you have a chance to kind of calm yourself down, take some deep breaths, I'll be able to hear you. I'll hear what you want, and you'll let me know you're ready to have the conversation. And I will sometimes, and that doesn't mean you're still going to get the toy, but you're really going to hear their feelings, because otherwise you're like, oh, come on, and you want to sort of pull them along the linoleum, right, and get them to the car. And so I will say to people, you're yelling at me right now means you want to be taken seriously. The problem is I'm just hearing the yelling. I'm hearing the volume, and I'm seeing the look on your face, and I'm not hearing your words. So if you can take some deep breaths and just share your thoughts, then I can hear you. It might be that I agree or that I don't agree, but more importantly, you'll feel like I'm really listening. And so sometimes I just need to be able to find a way, and I guide families to find a way to turn the volume down on the emotions, on literally the volume at times, just so there is some civility. And right now, what's sorely lacking in our society is civility. And so it's a hard sell to teach that at times.
The way that people interact with politics nowadays, and I think that a lot of this, once again, goes back to social media and the way that social media just amplifies the most negative emotional sentiments that can be said. You don't see something unless it's the biggest, most emotional, most emotionally charged version of something. Nuance doesn't work well in the algorithm. So you don't see those nuanced or fair and balanced or more measured analysis of things. You just see the people screaming. And I think that because of that, we all are guilty of that. We all are guilty of this thing where we villainize people. Our discourse boils down to just screaming at the other person that they're bad or evil or, whatever extreme buzzword there is. And that's just not how you appeal to somebody. That's not how you talk to somebody. That's not how you get on the same page with somebody. And I've talked to people, who are experts in like working with, helping people get out of cults and cult deprogrammers and things like that. And, they've said the same thing. That's just not, whenever somebody's in a bad or toxic mindset, the worst thing you can do is just sit there and scream at them that they're an idiot or that they're in a cult or whatever it is. That's not how you handle it. So I would agree with what you're saying. I think that we as a people in general, and maybe this is more specifically the US. I know Canada has some issues and there's issues all around the world, but I kind of, maybe I'm in it, so I'm more exposed to it. But I feel like the US is like particularly bad at this. But we've gotten to a point where there's no healthy discourse about anything. We just scream at each other and call each other names. And then we always think that the other person is the one who is being the aggressor.
I agree with you. I don't know if there's any, there's no easy fix because the views are so entrenched. The hatred is so deep. There won't be it's going to take a while for things to calm down. I thought at first that maybe Biden's presidency would create more calm, but I don't think that's happened because his opponents are just as strong as ever. I think also that he's made some big mistakes in making the other side feel like losers, and he's not been as open to reconciliation as I had hoped.
So the thing that's talked about a lot with this is this idea of when these people get really deep into Q, they start isolating themselves from their family. Their family doesn't want to talk to them anymore. They've ranted one too many times at a family function or whatever. And, people are getting divorced because of it and all these things. And there's this idea that is talked about a lot where it's like, these are consequences. Like, you get into Q and the consequence that you see is that you are shunned by your family, and that there's some sort of idea of like, these are the consequences. And these people, over time will realize like, oh, I've gotten so deep into this that I'm completely miserable. My family doesn't want to talk to me anymore. And that will one day kind of shake them out of it and be like, oh, like what am I doing? Like, I've lost every person close to me because of this thing. Like, why am I doing that? So I guess, with everything that you just said, would you argue, or I guess, what is your argument, or what is your thought on, what I'm kind of basically gathering from this is like, in the long run, supporting your family and trying to, stay with them and help them through these things and provide a support system is a stronger path than this idea of like them being isolated and suffering the consequences of believing in these things, and therefore sort of realizing that they've ruined their lives, and that can kind of shake them out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there are real life consequences. And if someone has no money, no home, and no access to the internet, and that's an extreme example, then maybe they will wake up and say, holy crap. Or maybe it will have pointed out that there is some, mania, mental illness there that has come to the fore. That's going to be a very small percentage. Yes, staying connected is the most important thing. And the rants, if you can withstand some of them, hopefully you'll be able to get in some meaningful dialogue along the way. But the rants are going to be a part of it, because that excitation, the way our brains work when we get new information that people consider essential to your well-being. Have you heard the good news? When people show up at your door with a Bible tract, Jesus is Lord, and there you can tell there's like something going on there. Well, that same impulse exists for certain individuals who are involved with Q ideology. It's that same kind of a psychological and neurological response to the ideas. So knowing that doesn't last forever is a good thing. And like I said, in studies where they've researched people who were involved in cults, we find that most of the people leave over time. And how people leave can be a feature of how the parents and family accepts them. I don't know you anymore, but yet that underneath that overlay of these crazy ideas is really the person you love, and trying to get at that. And that takes sometimes practice. It takes patience. It takes working with family therapists who are knowledgeable in this area, and seeing if you can patch it up, because if it isn't working for them, they will eventually go away from the idea. But in the beginning, in that honeymoon period, when the idea is so exciting, it's a bad time to approach someone, because this is exactly when the group counts on having you gel with the ideas and the philosophies, so that there may be behavioral changes. So what I'm kind of getting at is, you have different periods in a person's involvement. You have the beginning phase when people are enthusiastic. You have the middle phase when, they may or may not associate with the ideas. But if everybody around you has gone and said, screw you, you're left with these people and you're committed to them then. You're more deeply committed because that's all you got. And so that can lead to more extreme behaviors and less of an ability for you to affect change in their lives in order to help them.
And finally, all that being said, we're going to definitely delve into this more in the last episode, but I quickly want to just talk with the guests about how they feel media and social media have played into the growth of QAnon and the polarization between QAnon followers and QAnon skeptics, and how the interplay of social media algorithms, the way that social media makes us interact with each other and has shifted and changed communication between people, and how mainstream media organizations and news sites and internet publications have fed into that to deliver narratives in a polarized way, and whether or not we feel like social media and media organizations have any culpability in the rise of QAnon and the growth of it. What role do you think that the media has played in normalizing or platforming QAnon? To what degree do you think that that's happened? And I guess, what are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I kind of think less of a role than people think, mainly because I think the people who are getting, kind of red pilled on QAnon are not generally like huge fans of, I don't think they're like, there's a huge like reading my articles to QAnon pipeline. When you talk to people about like, how did you get into QAnon? It's like, well, I saw this YouTube video, or I heard it mentioned on this already kind of conspiracy theory YouTube show I watch or something. It's very rarely like, well, I read an article in the New York Times about QAnon and I was like, oh, these guys have a lot to say, but at the same time, I mean, it's something to be conscious of. I think people certainly make mistakes sometimes. I mean, just, around 2016, there was this whole debate over, similarly how people covered white supremacists. And it was like, Mother Jones famously had this one that was like about Richard Spencer, like the dapper Nazi, oh, look at this charming man. Whereas, and so I think in the past few years, I think there's been a lot of thinking on that, and I hopefully think it's improved. But yeah, I mean, it's something I certainly always want to be conscious of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that I'm constantly torn on, because we've talked a lot about the idea of like, because we're having you on the show, and we've set up some other discussions with a few other people. We're doing an interview with Mike Rothschild, and we're trying to get some of the QAnon Anonymous guys on the show, and some other people, maybe not as QAnon specifically related, but we have talked about the idea of like, well, if we're gonna get these guys on the show, then maybe we should try to at least get a couple of pro QAnon people, or at least reformed QAnon people, just so it doesn't feel completely like biased. Like I don't think it's biased, but I think that would be the perception of it, is if somebody listened to an episode and it's all just people who think that QAnon is insane, that it would lessen its impact on a potential person that might hear our episode, and maybe they were like on the precipice of getting red pilled, and then they listen to this, multi-episode deep dive, and they're like, oh, actually, you know what? I was maybe almost there. Like, I don't think we're going to like reform like true believers, but maybe there's a handful of our audience that are like kind of almost there. And then we are able to help talk them back from a ledge, and that it might lessen that impact if we just only had this very particularly biased perspective on here. But also, like, I'm just so concerned about the idea of platforming anybody even remotely involved in QAnon. And I also just don't really have any interest in like getting into a back and forth screaming match of like, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. So I'm constantly torn about the idea of like whether or not we should be like engaging with them, or because I feel like there's just no right answer, or at least that my brain is capable of processing. Cause it's like, I feel like when we ignored them and treated them like crazy people, that was when they were able to fester and grow, like almost like like a cancer that was hidden below the skin. And then whenever we did focus on them, it gave them like validation. It's like, what do you do? It's like a catch-22 in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think those are all good instincts. I mean, for me particularly, in the start of QAnon, it was kind of the focus on like, what's the real world effect of this? Both because you don't want to be kind of promoting some internet nonsense that doesn't matter, but also like because it's boring just talking about like internet drama, and so you want to see like what's really happening. And so it was at a point where QAnon believers were murdering people and stuff, and people would say, "Should we be covering this?" And it's like you have to have enough, I think, respect for your audience to think that they can handle knowing what's going on in the world.
Yeah. There's a part of me that just feels like that I don't want to like not provide all perspectives, and I don't want to like censor people or deplatform people. But if I could just present the best, most airtight logic, that it would be undeniable of like, you've heard both perspectives, but we will clearly lay out that this is the right one. That's like what my brain wants to do. It's like obsessed with that. But the more and more I have inundated myself with this, the more and more I'm like, that's just not like, the logic doesn't apply. Like this all lives in emotional truth rather than like there's no scenario in which anybody would ever be like, oh, I guess I'm wrong because you've explained it to me and now I realize. Like that's just not really going to happen at a large scale. What are your thoughts on the general idea of this like mass deplatforming of bad actors? We've seen Alex Jones be sort of like kicked off of social media entirely. We've seen, Trump banned from Twitter. And all these other, instances, QAnon just completely being deplatformed from platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And, I think it has a demonstrable positive effect, in my opinion. Like say what you want about Joe Biden and whether or not he has done anything good so far, or whether or not he was actually a good choice for the president and not just like the better option between him and Trump. But regardless of that, there was like an immediate demonstrable like, oh, things like just feel better once Trump was like kicked off of Twitter. Like no matter what anybody says, like there was an effect. But what do you think about the general? Because there's that, but then there's like, oh, but then what happens whenever something else gets deplatformed that's like a fringe belief, but it's more legitimate and actually based on reality? Like what are your thoughts on the general idea of like these tech companies deplatforming people basically on their own whim based on like pushback from their users?
Yeah, this is, I think, really an issue where there really is no simplistic or easy sort of answer. Like when I sort of like I frequently use web forums and sort of like BBSs and like news groups in the 90s and like early 2000s. There was this feeling of like the mods are gods, in the sense that like if a 19-year-old moderator banned you because they broke up with their girlfriend that day, that was life. You just had to deal with it. Sometimes you get banned. Sometimes you get the bam hammer. Sometimes you get perma-banned just cause. There was the sense of like, it's all arbitrary and it's not a big deal. And that was always the sort of sense I get. Like, listen, the mods are gods. This is their platform, and the rest of us have to live with it. And of course there is a difference now, that because of network effects, because all of a sudden these platforms, they've managed very cleverly to wield enormous power about what sort of ideas get amplified. There is a danger that they will basically totally control the sort of the barriers of what is considered acceptable, popular, mainstream speech. And that's just a byproduct of the internet. And I don't know how you can possibly solve that problem, without destroying the internet, which is like always a solution on the table. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The thing is that if you're coming at it from a pure, consequentialist, utilitarian kind of perspective, it is I think, objectively good thing that QAnon was banned. It's a good thing that Trump was not able to continue promoting his election lies and inciting more violence on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. But the thing is that, and that there are consequences if you really want to be like a sort of a totally what you call free speech kind of platform. And we can see this recently with, for example, the platform Getter, which was started by some Trump aides. That's supposedly a free speech platform. And it was recently flooded with jihadist pro-ISIS propaganda. So it's like, I don't think, it's like, is there really any benefit to, like, you know, that kind of obviously destructive, extremist propaganda getting a voice? I don't think so. But yeah, I mean, I really don't see how there's any sort of solution. Like the thing is that if you allow any sort of, like, if you do zero moderation. Now, first of all, this would be unusual in the history of the internet. Like, every single platform in the history of the internet has always been moderated to some extent. And if you don't moderate it at all, that turns into a cesspool like 8chan, which is so vile that even QAnon promoters do not recommend their followers to go and visit. But on the other hand, if you sort of, you have to recognize that these platforms are extremely powerful, and that allows them to, you know, control sort of popular mainstream speech in a way that's unprecedented. I mean, I don't think I have any solutions. I think the internet was a mistake and we're fucked.
Yeah. So your solution is, we got to do the escape from LA plan, and we just got to, like, nuke it. We just got to, like, press the button and wipe out the grid.
Exactly. We need to find a way to have a controlling stake in Twitter and then just shut it down for the good of humanity.
When I finished my book last December, you know, I knew more than most people about QAnon, but since then I've spent a lot more time on the topic. And one way that my knowledge has increased is doing more study on the way that the way that big tech is used to influence us and shape us. So I'm now more open to the theory that various operatives in the Trump world latched onto QAnon early on, and some of the main Trump leaders behind the scenes, they took Q material and amplified it and spread it. And so you have this QAnon movement starting, you know, going on 4 years. And within 2 years, it has millions of people following it. So we're seduced by the internet in ways that we hardly imagine.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big topic of discussion in this entire thing that we're doing. I mean, it's definitely about QAnon and the movement and what's happened and how we should interpret it, but it's also very largely about how we got here. I mean, you talk about this in your book too. It's, you know, this is not new territory. It's just something that I think is important for people to hear and understand, is just the way that these platforms that we're on, these social media platforms, and the algorithms that serve us content, and the way that things are served to us, and the way that they learn about us, and you know, continue showing us things further and further into the fringes of these interests and beliefs that we get off on, is it's a big part of how these things take root, how they spread, and it's just an amplification of the human mind's, like, inherent tendency to want to buy into conspiracy theory. And I don't mean conspiracy theory as in, like, there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll, but just any type of, like, putting patterns together and theorizing about the hidden truths behind things that we don't necessarily understand. And social media is just like, it's like one of those incubators that you put, like, cells into, and it evolves them at, like, a rapid rate. It's just, it's pushing forward all of these ways that our minds work, and the belief structures that we form around conspiracy theory. It's like amplifying them by, like, 10, 20, 100 times in a way that's very terrifying to me, honestly. It's interesting that you say that there are no simple solutions and cults present a simple solution, because I almost feel like, you know, there's sort of the QAnon stuff, which I obviously think is very
concerning. It's tons of misinformation tied up with some things that are, maybe generally true. Like, there's truth to the idea that there's corruption in government and Hollywood. Like, obviously there's like kernels of truth in these things, but overall this is a destructive, harmful thing that is less about the truth of the things. It's more about these individual people's, trying to find answers for issues in their lives, and then people taking advantage of that. I think that that's definitely true. But then there's also like almost like a counter movement that has sprung up in response to that, of like this movement of like violently anti-Q, where there's this large community of people on the internet that devote their lives to like ridiculing these people. And then there are almost like the counter influencers of that movement that are like these people who are just, they're almost conspiracy theories in their own right, where these people that talk about like, Donald Trump is going to go to jail any day. Like they've like, there's like this counter almost cult of, liberals and more left-leaning people who are almost as obsessed with hating QAnon and QAnon people and ridiculing them and talking about how, like laughing every time that their predictions don't come true, that are almost as obsessed with that as QAnon people are obsessed with Democrats being, satanic pedophiles. And I feel like maybe that's almost maybe slightly less malevolent than what QAnon is, maybe. But I still find it interesting that, like, do you find that happens?
I think that's part of what I've seen over the years in the anti-cult network, that there are rabid anti-cultists who leave groups and want nothing more than to destroy all references of the group. And in the process, they end up putting off the opportunity to help people that would be more likely to leave if it was about a conversation, if it was about respect, if it was about seeing them as human beings just like you. They forget that they were once there. And maybe many of the people who have seen the harm of Q feel, they're raging. They're raging in the same way that those who are raging against, the liberal policies of the Democrats and the fact that they encourage, what they believe they encourage, socialism, or communism. So yeah, the boogeyman goes from being, us to them, and then back to us again. We're the critic, and to become a troll in any setting is not a very pretty picture. I mean, it's not decent to try to scream people out of their misunderstanding. It just is very rarely, very, very rarely effective. And if you want to be effective, then you really have to be respectful and understanding. You have to walk on their playing field in order to understand how to play their game. And by that, I mean, understand the dynamic that led them there and really work on developing a better relationship with the person, trying to create more and more of an opportunity for Q to become less and less attractive. What we find is that with cults, that when you attack an individual who is a cult member, they will run headlong into the group and be loved by that group. Love bombing, they call it. And what we want to do is avoid that dynamic. We don't want to create the dynamic by which the only comfort the individual who's abiding by Q philosophy or ideas goes back to Q for comfort. Oh yeah, my family did the same thing. Here's what I did. And this is now their sounding board. So it becomes that echo chamber that led them to leave mainstream society and look at these ideas as being viable and interesting. First interesting, and then something that was worth exploring more deeply. And so, yeah, I don't really see the value in us becoming zealots on the other side. Zealotry always carries with it a certain danger of violent extremism and unwillingness to see from the other person's point of view. And that's really what we try to do when we meet people who are affected by extreme ideologies. We try to really understand them, where they find themselves, how they got there, what was it that led them there. And yeah, it sounds all very sunshine and lollipops, but it ain't easy to get there. It's a process, and you have to have patience with the people you're concerned with, and not call them names. Name calling doesn't lead to a lot of compassionate responses. It just leads people to go more deeply into the people who appear to be those understanding figures, even if they are behind a screen and they've never met them face to face.
Right. I mean, social media has been interesting because for some people, it's been a lifeline. It has helped them not feel alone. It's helped them feel connected, reconnect with people they haven't seen in a very long time. It's gotten them connected to what they think are important things to know about. And it could be what's happening in the world. It could be trends, whatever it is, but it helps people do feel interconnected. It's also true that it's brought forth a lot of aggression and people being very cruel because they can in a faceless way from behind the scenes, with doing death threats to people who they just, don't happen to like. And there have been some people who have become famous on Instagram or TikTok who have sometimes had to stay home for periods of time because they're scared. And so it can unleash a lot of very bad behavior. But I think with things like movements, social media is so influential because it can wrap things up in such a appealing way that people get swayed by how many likes somebody has gotten, or by watching a video where a person who says that they're highly spiritual, are very kind of backlit. So, right, if you have someone who says, I am really spiritual, but their lighting is great, then you also want to make sure not to trust that, because that it's, all pomp with no circumstance. But you can get very swayed by it. And so I think that there are people who have gotten involved in cults in a much easier way because they never had to leave their house. They didn't have to drop out of school necessarily to go join whomever. They didn't need to go to meetings. There is a man, Stephen Molyneux, who was recruiting people, I think still is, telling them to leave their home, leave their family, not tell them where they're going and just take off. And these are people who have gotten involved in this group, never having met anyone else in the group. But these are these consistent friends who are on their computer, wherever they are. And there is this intimacy, like you're always there for me in the middle of the night, in the darkness of my room or in my basement or my car. And so I think it has given people the ability to be targeted over and over and over again. And so people have access to people on their computers all the time. And they also especially during COVID, where people were feeling disconnected, this was a connection. There are people who've gotten radicalized into a lot of things, into extremist kind of thinking also on the internet, and got to a point where they'd be willing to sacrifice themselves, their lives for a cause, for people who they've never met in person, because the message was one of such caring, and we want you to feel important, and this cause is so important. And what was happening around them in the world was making them feel less than, or in their home wasn't wasn't a place where they felt people really saw them and their potential. So people can get into your homes and into your minds on social media in a way that you just really need to be cautious about.
So I hope that before we get into the final stretch of the story, that has kind of really illuminated a lot of the sort of philosophical and sociological aspects of this, and helped you to realign your mindset going into the final stretch of the story to really, I'm not sitting here saying that you need to empathize more with these people. or sympathize more with these people. I mean, just to give a little bit of insight into this, my sort of evolution throughout the last several years, just to give a benchmark. Last year we did an episode about Richard McCaslin, the Phantom Patriot, who was this guy who, he was a mega conspiracy theorist who believed in all of the deep state, satanic cabal stuff. He kind of existed long before QAnon existed. And, he actually later in life, before he died, he was critical of QAnon and thought it was a deep state psyop. But he generally had similar beliefs as QAnon, except for he thought that Donald Trump was also a part of the deep state. But we did this episode about him, and he dressed up as this superhero called the Phantom Patriot, as well as other superheroes, but particularly this one character called the Phantom Patriot, who was a superhero that fought to take down the deep state. And he was radicalized through conspiracy theory networks and watching Alex Jones and InfoWars documentaries back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he ended up basically being inspired to go dressed as his character, fully armed, to the Bohemian Grove, which is this upscale country club for rich celebrities and politicians in Northern California. That, there's this conspiracy theory that there's a lot of like satanic rituals and child sacrifice that go on there. And he decided to dress up as his character and go storm the Bohemian Grove and basically rescue these children, these child slaves. And he went there and he did it, and nothing was there, and he got caught, and he went to prison, and he ended up getting out of jail and kind of going on to further his mission of trying to bring down the deep state by protesting across the country. And he was just this fully radicalized and indoctrinated conspiracy theorist who ended up taking his own life. And when we did that episode, obviously I'm not one of those people that, relishes in my enemies getting hurt or dying or committing suicide. I'm not one of those people that's going to be out there posting like, laughing about somebody dying from COVID when they refuse to get the vaccine. That's just, that's not my energy at all. But at the time I was, I think you can sort of chalk up my view on these things, on these conspiracy theory movements and these people who participate in them, in that I was sort of angry at Richard McCaslin. I had a very adversarial attitude about him. And I did not sympathize with him at all. I just thought, this guy, he's an adult. He obviously struggling with mental health issues, and, there's no discounting that. But at a certain point, whenever you are struggling with mental health issues and you refuse to seek help for them, at some point you have to be culpable for your own behaviors and responsible for your own actions. And that's kind of how I felt about it, and how I've always kind of felt about it with these conspiracy theory movements and these like disinformation campaigns and this sort of post-truth, postmodern approach to reality that has sort of slowly crept into our society in the last several decades. I'm somebody who very much values having an objective baseline of truth and reality, and very obsessed with facts and data, and coming at everything from a analytical, quantitative standpoint. So obviously these types of people kind of give me a lot of anxiety. So that's kind of that's been my approach. That's how I felt about things at that time, in around November. So basically about exactly a year ago. And I've been following QAnon for longer than that, since back in 2017. And I've basically felt that same way about QAnon. But in the last several months, since the beginning of the year, since really getting into full deep dive researching on QAnon towards the end of the year last year, and into the beginning of the year after January 6th, and into the deep research in preparation for making these episodes, reading multiple books, including some of the books from the guests that we've had here. Mike Rothschild's book, The Storm is Upon Us, and James Beverley's book, The QAnon Deception. And just learning more about these people, diving deep into some of the conversations that have been had around them, the dynamics between Q and the influencer grifters and the followers and the boomer normies that found out about QAnon through, Facebook memes, and the people who latched onto it during the 2020 pandemic because they were just scared of what was happening and just couldn't process it. I ended up kind of developing myself a tremendous amount of empathy and sympathy for these people. And I kind of realized that, the approach of just writing them off and saying these people are crazy and dumb and fuck them and they can all go to hell, and I'm just going to mock them on the internet and post articles about dumb shit they've done and with pithy captions about like, oh, I can't believe these people still believe this and all this stuff. And the George Takei version of things where, he says he's for peace and unity and that, he is on the side of good, and yet he'll just post an article about some dumb thing that a QAnon person has done with some, pithy caption being like, I can't believe I live on the same planet as this person. Oh my, or whatever. And just realized kind of how that whole thing is just not helping. It's not making this better at all. It's counterintuitive to everything that I've learned from talking to these experts, including somebody like Joe Kelly. I've talked to other experts as well in preparation for this episode. Everybody I know who is an expert and has decades of experience with working with people to get them out of cults or to deal with family members who are in cults, everything that I've talked to them about and read about is antithetical to the way that we on a mainstream scale deal with QAnon. It's like the exact opposite of what we should be doing. So I really just wanted to frame this whole idea and kind of make it its own episode. Originally, this was supposed to be interviews that were kind of like interwoven in the main episode. Like I was going to take these pieces and kind of put them into the main episodes, but I realized over time that it would kind of it would obfuscate and kind of muddy the point or the message that I really wanted to get across at the end of the day with this whole series. So I decided that it would be better to have it as its own kind of thing. And I really just wanted to frame this whole series with this idea that, yes, this is interesting. Yes, these stories are fascinating. Yes, the things that they believe are largely misinformation and blatant lies, and these grifter influencer people are the scum of the earth, and I do not have any empathy for them. I don't have any empathy for Jordan Sather and Joe M and all these people. I'm not talking about them. You can mock them on the internet all you want. But the glut of these people, these people that follow this, are people who are just they're just crushingly sad and lost and confused, and they have rightly become frustrated with the state of our society and our world and the massive economic disparity and the corruption in all facets of government, and the way that the world is just obsessed with celebrity, and the way that commodification and celebrity worship and efficiency of capitalistic infrastructure has taken precedent over like human lives. And they've rightly become frustrated to their final breaking point on these things, and they've been so led astray by these people who have recognized that, and they have manipulated and taken advantage of it to amass clout and fame and power and influence. It's just crushingly sad to me, and if you take anything away from this whole series, and like I said, yes, it's all entertaining. Yes, these things are misinformation, and A lot of it is really bizarre. And yes, we've laughed at some of that stuff and we've made fun of some of this stuff. Hopefully we've more made fun of the grifters and the Jerome Corsis of it all, more so than the sort of people who have been victimized and taken advantage of in these situations. And yes, it is all, in a sense, very entertaining and kind of mind-boggling in a fascinating way. But if you take one thing away from this, I really hope it's that the way that we're approaching this is just not helping. When we share these articles about shit that they've done and we mock and talk about how crazy they are or whatever, it's not helping the situation. Whenever you get into an argument with somebody and you just start telling them they're in a cult and saying that they need to get mental help, like all you're doing is pushing them further down a rabbit hole. And if I can impart one piece of advice, I would say to people, just stop. Just stop talking to these people whenever you're on some Facebook post and somebody says some weird QAnon bullshit. I'm not talking about like saying racist shit or whatever, or sexist shit. If somebody's saying racist shit or sexist shit, like, yeah, like fucking say whatever you want to them. Like talk shit to them, mock them, whatever. But when people are clearly just in the thick of in the miasma of this conspiracy stranglehold that has gripped a large chunk of our country, just stop. Just don't talk to them. Just ignore them. Just move on. Unless you really want, if you are going to engage, be prepared to have a real, actual good faith attempt at discourse, not just like dunking on them and making fun of the things that they're saying and talking about how crazy it is. If you really want to talk to these people and you really want to engage, be prepared to have a real, actual conversation where you are willing to hear them out and you are willing to express empathy towards whatever pain that they're experiencing that's causing them to say and think these things. And be prepared to really systematically go through and try to help them understand how these things are not true, which is a big undertaking. It's not just going into a Facebook comment section and being like, that's not true, lol, you're an idiot. It's really, and it's not even just really laying out the facts, because if you just link them to articles that have the facts, they're just going to say it's fake. They're not going to read it. It's really just like committing to explaining to them, meeting them where they are and being like, okay, why do you believe this? That's why you believe this. Okay, so if you believe that, then just for instance, let me kind of talk you through this and see if this makes sense to you, or see if this still works with what I explained to you. And here is the evidence. Here are the facts of this. And I'm not going to shove this in your face or say, told you so, or say like, ha, you're an idiot. I'm going to really just kind of in good faith show you this information, show you these facts, show you multiple examples of the facts from different sources, and kind of walk you through what they mean, and try to meet you in the middle and kind of appeal to the way that you're thinking about these things to help you to slowly understand that what you're saying is not true. It takes a tremendous amount of patience, and it takes a tremendous amount of research and willingness to present and interpret information for somebody. And that's just not for everybody. Most people are just not going to have the energy or really the equipping to do that. I'm just being honest. Most people you're just not going to have the skill set to be able to do that correctly. And so, yeah, like I said, if I could impart any advice, I would say, unless you're willing to do that, unless you're willing to commit to talking with somebody for, hours, for an hour, a couple hours, and really patiently walking them through something and trying to meet them in the middle and help them to gain an understanding without the mockery and the arrogance and the condescension, which are all things that are going to push them further down the rabbit hole rather than pull them out. But really work to like help them to understand something in a positive way that coaxes them out of the rabbit hole. Unless you're willing to do that, anything short of that is just destructive and toxic, and it's not going to help, and you should just stop. You should just if you're not willing to go to that level, you should disengage. You should stop talking to the person. You should just not comment anymore. You should leave it alone. Nothing that you're going to say is going to help the situation. And stop participating in this like Roman Colosseum-esque public mockery and shaming culture of these people, where we all just pass around these silly articles of dumb things that they've done and kind of like talk down our noses at it. I'm not trying to excuse these things or say that we should expend the emotional energy to empathize with people who are spreading lies and bad, negative shit. I'm not really asking you to do anything. I'm asking you to sort of not do something. Just remove yourself from this weird, we're all sitting in the Colosseum stands watching a gladiator like fight a lion thing that we've decided is okay to do. I think that that's really the only thing that any one individual person has the power over to try to make this whole thing a little bit better. You can't change their minds really unless you really want to commit to taking on the project of changing someone's mind. And even that is a gamble, a crapshoot of if it's going to happen. We can't change their minds. We can't just reach out and make our politicians address this properly. We can't just make them denounce it. We have really not a whole lot of power. The only real power we have over is ourselves and our own behavior and interaction with these things. And the only thing we can really do and have control over is just taking ourselves out of the equation and just not contributing any more toxicity and furthering of pushing these people down into their fiefdoms and further proving to them that they are alone and alienated and isolated and nobody understands them, and the things that they believe are true because they're so controversial that they have to be true, because why would people be so obsessed with making fun of these things and mocking them and talking about how wrong they were unless they were right and people were just trying to get them off the scent, or they didn't want to accept the truth because it was too hard to accept. Just take yourself out of the equation for literally the good of humanity. So let's wrap up and hear some plugs from our guests. So is there anything else you want to plug?
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Will Sommer, SOMMER, and we have a podcast at the Daily Beast that covers QAnon and lots of other kind of right-wing craziness called Fever Dreams that I'm on. So available wherever fine podcasts are sent out.
Yeah. If you want to talk about QAnon more than you can possibly handle and sort of related conspiracy theories, and we've also been covering a lot of New Age nonsense recently, because that's another important sort of factor in the evolution of QAnon. It's not just traditionally far right nonsense anymore. It's crystals, it's yoga, it's 5D ascension, it's UFOs. So we're talking a lot about the ways in which this sort of extremist ideology is creeping into those realms as well. Check out QAnon Anonymous, which is available on your favorite podcasting app.
So if people want to hear more from people who have been involved in QAnon or cultic groups and what's helped them, and also to hear about how people can interact with those who are involved in something that's making them concerned, certainly you can contact me. You can listen to my podcast, Indoctrination. You can find out a lot of information from something called the International Cultic Studies Association that has workshops all the time and lots of materials and lots of guidance for the loved ones, as well as for people who are former members of things and also people considering leaving.
Cult News 101 is our news resource, and that really helps alert people to the nature of groups and undue influence in our culture and society. We look at the broader picture. So there's a lot about QAnon on the website. And from there, if you wanted to reach me or my colleague, Patrick Ryan, my email address is joekelly411@gmail.com. So if you have any other questions personally that you'd like to follow up with, I'd be happy to speak with you.
So, your book is The Storm is Upon Us. It's out. It's been out for a month or so.
Little over a month, yeah.
I definitely recommend it if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. Is there anything else that you want to plug or anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Rothschild MD. I tell people this all the time. MD is just my initials. I'm not a doctor. And I also no relation to the Rothschild banking family. I get that a lot. And I'm just really excited about the response the book has gotten. You can get it anywhere. If Amazon's your thing, that's fine. Any brick and mortar bookstore, bookshop.org for an independent store. You can get it directly from the publisher. So yeah, there are no shortage of ways to get the book. There's an ebook, there's an audiobook. We got all your Q bases covered.
I'd like to tell listeners they can get my QAnon Deception book on Amazon.
I would definitely recommend the QAnon Deception. It's one of the books that I read in preparation for this entire series.
And also, people that are real keeners, they can go to my website, jamesbeverley.com, Ley on the end of Beverly, and follow the links to my other books. And if people prefer PDF versions of books, they can get PDFs through my website.
Deep Cuts is a production by Boy Genius Media. If you'd like to find this show and others like it, please visit boygeniusmedia.com or deepcutspod.com.
If you want to join in on post-episode discussions, please join the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Finally, subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional video content.